A woman walks into a saloon at the edge of nowhere, and the room goes quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet. The kind that happens when men recognize something they cannot name but know enough to fear. Outside, Savage Mountain rises against a winter sky, the color of a bruise. Snow has buried the trail. The temperature has dropped past the point where the cold stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like a decision the world has made about you. Personally, inside, a man behind the bar sets down his glass and does not pick it up again. Somewhere up that mountain, a child has not spoken in 8 months. Somewhere behind her, men are coming with money and guns and a version of the law that bends toward whoever can afford it. She does not look back. She never looks back. The mountain waits. The winter of 1883 arrived in the Idaho Territory the way bad news always does. All at once, without apology. His phone never stopped ringing. With a cold that didn't simply drop the temperature, it made you question every decision that had led you a place where the wind could strip flesh from bone if you were foolish enough to stand against it long enough. Settlers Fork wasn't a town so much as a negotiation. 30 structures had agreed, for the time being, not to fall down, huddled together at the base of what locals called Savage Mountain. A name that appeared on no government survey, no official map, no territorial record, just the name that stuck because places earn their names the way people earn their reputations. Slowly, then all at once, the mountain rose behind the town like a wall someone had built to keep the rest of the world out. Or to keep something in. Depending on who you asked and how much they'd had to drink, you got different answers about which it was. Pete Garner's saloon sat dead center on the main street, which wasn't much of a main street, which wasn't much of a street at all. Packed earth and frozen mud, and the memory of warmer months when men walked without their shoulders permanently raised toward their ears. The saloon was the warmest building in town, because Pete never let the fire die, and because men needed somewhere to go when the cold got philosophical. They were doing what they always did on the nights a new bride arrived for Samuel Hardin. Bedding. Roy Dempsey had the list. He always had the list. A piece of paper folded into quarters, soft at the creases from so many openings that the folds had gone white. 24 names in his cramped handwriting, each followed by a number. The number was days. 3 days, 2 days, 9 days, that was the record, 9. His phone never, a woman named Marfowler, who'd lasted long enough to give the town genuine hope, before she came flying down that mountain trail on a borrowed horse with nothing but the clothes on her back, and eyes that had rearranged her understanding of what the world was capable of producing. None of them had ever said what happened up there. That was the part that kept the bets interesting. They came down silent, every last one of them. Got on the next available transport and left Settlers Fork without looking back, without explanation, without anything that might have satisfied the town's considerable curiosity. Roy spread the paper on the bar and smoothed it with his palm. 3 days, maybe 4, if she's stubborn, Frank bellows. The blacksmith had hands like splitting mauls and opinions like a man who'd never been wrong about anything worth being right about. 2. Came all the way from Colorado, I heard. That's desperation. Desperate women make mistakes. Desperate women survive things that would bury most men in this room, said a voice from the far end of the bar. Both men looked. Neither had noticed Cal Morrow come in, which was remarkable because Cal was the stagecoach driver, and he smelled like horses and wet wool and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 2 days on a bench seat in a December storm. Snow clung to his beard in clumps that hadn't melted yet. His eyes held something the others hadn't seen from him before. Genuine unease. The settled kind. The kind that had taken up residence and wasn't planning to leave quickly. She's here, Cal said. Already, the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something shifts without anyone being able to name what shifted already. Roy looked up from his paper. Samuel's telegram said end of the month. Well, Cal pulled off his gloves finger by finger. She's here now. Climbed down from my coach about an hour ago and walked straight to Walt Sutton's store without asking anyone for directions. Didn't ask about the town. Didn't ask about Samuel. Didn't ask me a single question during the 2 days I drove her up from Silver City. Except one. What'd she ask? She asked how far past the pass the trail got dangerous. Cal accepted the glass Pete set in front of him without ceremony. Drank, set it down, not whether it was dangerous. How far past the pass? Frank snorted. Brave. They're all brave at the beginning. There's brave and then there's something else. Cal stared at the bar like he was reading something in the grain of the wood. This woman, Rose Calloway, she carried a rifle the whole ride. Not nervously, the way a carpenter carries a hammer. Like it was just part of her. She checked the mechanism twice during the journey. No anxiety in it. No performance. Just checked it the way you'd check that your coat was buttoned before stepping into a storm. Armed bride, Roy said. That's new. She didn't sleep once. 2 days. Just watched the landscape like she was reading it. Not the pretty parts. The useful parts. Where the trail narrowed. Where the rock faces gave cover. Where you could see a long distance in one direction and without being seen from another. Cal set his glass down. She had the eyes of some cataloging for everything that might matter later. The room sat with that. Where is she now? Frank asked. Walt Sutton's store. Said she needed supplies before heading up tonight. Tonight? Roy's eyebrows climbed. That trail is a death sentence in daylight this time of year. At night, in this cold, I told her that, and she said darkness didn't matter much to her anymore. The room went quiet again. A different quality of quiet, the kind that follows when someone says something that sounds like more than what it is. Pete Garner had been wiping the same section of bar for the last 4 minutes. He was a large man, German by birth and American by a decision he'd made 30 years ago and never revisited. He'd survived enough to know the difference between a thing that was interesting and a thing that mattered. He set the cloth down with care. I'm not taking any bets on this one, he said. Roy looked at him. You always bet. Not tonight. Nobody pressed him for the reason. Some things you simply understand. The winter of 1883 arrived in the Idaho Territory the way bad news always does. All at once. Without apology. His phone never stopped ringing. With a cold that didn't simply drop the temperature. It made you question every decision that had led you to a place where the wind could strip flesh from bone if you were foolish enough to stand against it long enough. Settlers Fork wasn't a town so much as a negotiation. 30 structures had agreed, for the time being, not to fall down, huddled together at the base of what locals called Savage Mountain. A name that appeared on no government survey, no official map, no territorial record. Just the name that stuck because places earn their names the way people earn their reputations. Slowly, then all at once, the mountain rose behind the town, like a wall someone had built to keep the rest of the world out. Or to keep something in. Depending on who you asked and how much they'd had to drink, you got different answers about which it was. Pete Garner's saloon sat dead center on the main street, which wasn't much of a main street, which wasn't much of a street at all. Packed earth and frozen mud, and the memory of warmer months, when men walked without their shoulders permanently raised toward their ears. The saloon was the warmest building in town, because Pete never let the fire die, and because men needed somewhere to go. When the cold got philosophical, they were doing what they always did on the nights a new bride arrived for Samuel Hardin. Betting. Roy Dempsey had the list. He always had the list. A piece of paper folded into quarters, soft at the creases from so many openings that the folds had gone white. 24 names in his cramped handwriting, each followed by a number. The number was days. 3 days, 2 days, 9 days, that was the record, 9. His phone never stopped ringing. Held by a woman named Margaret Fowler, who'd lasted long enough to give the town genuine hope before she came flying down that mountain trail on a borrowed horse, with nothing but the clothes on her back and eyes that had rearranged her understanding of what the world was capable of producing. None of them had ever said what happened up there. That was the part that kept the bets interesting. They came down silent, every last one of them, got on the next available transport and left Settlers Fork without looking back, without explanation, without anything that might have satisfied the town's considerable curiosity. Roy spread the paper on the bar and smoothed it with his palm. 3 days. Maybe 4, if she's stubborn, Frank bellows. The blacksmith had hands like splitting mauls and opinions, like a man who'd never been wrong about anything worth being right about. 2. Came all the way from Colorado, I heard. That's desperation. Desperate women make mistakes. Desperate women survive things that would bury most men in this room, said a voice from the far end of the bar. Both men looked. Neither had noticed Cal Morrow come in, which was remarkable because was the Scal couch driver, and he smelled like horses and wet wool, and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 2 days on a bench seat in a December storm. Snow clung to his beard in clumps that hadn't melted yet. His eyes held something the others hadn't seen from him before, genuine unease. The settled kind. The kind that had taken up residence and wasn't planning to leave quickly. She's here, Cal said. Already, the room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something shifts without anyone being able to name what shifted. Already. Roy looked up from his paper. Samuel's telegram said, end of the month. Well, Cal pulled off his gloves finger by finger. She's here now. Climbed down from my coach about an hour ago and walked straight to Walt Sutton's store without asking anyone for directions. Didn't ask about the town. Didn't ask about Samuel. Didn't ask me a single question during the 2 days I drove her up from Silver City. Except one. What'd she ask? She asked how far past the pass the trail got dangerous. Cal accepted the glass Pete set in front of him without ceremony. Drank. Set it down. Not whether it was dangerous. How far past the pass? Frank snorted. Brave. They're all brave at the beginning. There's brave and then there's something else. Cal stared at the bar like he was reading something in the grain of the wood. This woman, Rose Calloway. She carried a rifle the whole ride. Not nervously, the way a carpenter carries a hammer. Like it was just part of her. She checked the mechanism twice during the journey. No anxiety in it. No performance. Just checked it the way you'd check that your coat was buttoned before stepping into a storm. Armed bride, Roy said. That's new. She didn't sleep once. 2 days. Just watched the landscape like she was reading it. Not the pretty parts, the useful parts. Where the trail narrowed. Where the rock faces gave cover. Where you could see a long distance in one direction without being seen from another. Cal set his glass down. She had the eyes of someone cataloging everything that might matter later. The room sat with that. Where is she now? Frank asked. Walt Sutton's store. Said she needed supplies before heading up tonight. Tonight? Roy's eyebrows climbed. That trail is a death sentence in daylight this time of year. At night in this cold, I told her that, and? She said darkness didn't matter much to her anymore. The room went quiet again. A different quality of quiet. The kind that follows when someone says something that sounds like more than what it is. Pete Garner had been wiping the same section of bar for the last 4 minutes. He was a large man, German by birth and American by a decision he'd made 30 years ago and never revisited. He'd survived enough to know the difference between a thing that was interesting and a thing that mattered. He set the cloth down with care. I'm not taking any bets on this one, he said. Roy looked at him. You always bet? Not tonight? Nobody pressed him for the reason. Some things you simply understand. Walt Sutton's general store smelled like dried herbs and lamp oil, and the staleness of goods that had weathered too many winters in a building that was itself weathering. Shelves from floor to ceiling, barrels along the walls, a wood stove in the corner, doing its honest best against the cold, bleeding through gaps in the boards. Walt watched Rose Calloway from behind the counter, with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle that hadn't provided enough pieces. He was thin in the way anxious people often are, as though worry burned through calories faster than food could replace them. His spectacles kept sliding to the end of his nose. He kept pushing them back up. The items she placed on his counter told him a story he didn't entirely want to read. 3 boxes of ammunition in different calibers, dried meat in a quantity suited to months rather than weeks, salt, waterproof matches, a whetstone. Medical supply stopped ringing. Medical supplies of the serious variety. Not the kind kept for kitchen cuts, but the kind assembled by someone who understood that wounds might need stitching under circumstances where waiting for a doctor wasn't an option. Walt cleared his throat. Ma'am. Most ladies arriving for Mr. Harden tend to purchase more. That is, domestic goods are typically more. He stopped. Reassembled. I have a fine selection of fabrics and cooking spices. Quite a good selection, actually. How much? Rose didn't look up from examining the ammunition boxes. Walt blinked. I beg your pardon? For what's on the counter? Total. He calculated quickly. $14.30. Rose counted out exact change from a leather pouch without hesitation. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped spending emotional energy on small transactions. When she reached for the last coins, her coat shifted. Walt saw it, the knife handle at her belt. Plain grip, worn smooth in the way that came from use rather than decoration. And below the coat's hem, just visible above the boot, the suggestion of another handle. He pushed his spectacles up and made a deliberate decision not to mention either one. The trail to Mr. Harden's place, Rose said, consolidating her purchases into her pack for 5-hour climb, I was told. In summer, Walt said. In these conditions at night, he heard himself speaking and also heard, quite clearly, that the words were not going to accomplish anything. Men have died on that path. Experienced men. In daylight, men die everywhere. She shouldered the pack in a single clean motion. North edge of town? Yes, but thank you. The bell above the door announced her exit. Cold air pushed through the store like something that had been waiting outside and was annoyed at the delay. Walt stood still for a long moment. His eyes moved to the window. His phone never stopped ringing, where Rose Calloway was already crossing the frozen street without looking back, without looking at anything except the direction she was heading. He walked to his back office and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The locked one, the one his wife didn't know about. Inside, a ledger with a dark cover. He'd begun it after the third bride left, not from cruelty, but from something he couldn't name precisely. A kind of witnessing. Someone should keep the record. Someone should know their names. 24 entries, 24 arrivals, 24 departures. The shortest stay, 12 hours. A woman from Nevada who'd come back down before sunrise, moving like something was still chasing her, even after she'd gotten away. 2 women had come down injured, one with a broken arm, one with cuts that looked like she'd gone through glass. None of them had ever said a word about what happened up there. They just left town as fast as they could manage and never came back. Walt picked up his pen, wrote the name in careful script, wrote the date, Rose Calloway. December 3rd, 1883, his pen moved to the departure column, stopped. He thought about her hands on the ammunition boxes, the way she'd moved through the store without looking at anything she didn't intend to buy. The specific quality of her attention, not nervous, not desperate, not the hollow hope he'd seen in the eyes of most of the 24 who'd come before. Something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. He closed the ledger without filling in the departure date. Put it back, locked the drawer. He had done this exact thing for all 24 of them. Always telling himself it was habit, procedure, the maintenance of a record. This time felt different. This time the blank column didn't feel like an optimistic oversight. His phone never stopped ringing. It felt like a question he didn't yet know the answer to. He went back out to his store and straightened the shelf of cooking spices that didn't need straightening, and thought about a woman who bought ammunition in 3 calibers and asked about the trail without asking whether it was safe. The trail started the way difficult things usually do, gently. Rose moved through pine trees heavy with accumulated snow, her breath making small clouds in the frozen air, the rifle across her back, shifting with each step in the rhythm. She'd carried long enough that its absence would have thrown off her cants. The town shrank behind her in minutes. She didn't look back. Looking back was a habit she was still in the process of breaking. First hour, manageable. The path wide enough. The grade steady without being punishing. Trees close enough on both sides to break the worst of the wind. She set a pace designed to last. Not fast enough to exhaust herself before the real climbing started. Not slow enough to let the cold settle into her joints and make them wooden. She'd learned to pace herself the way you learn these things, when running has not been a choice but a calculation. The calculation had been simple in its brutal arithmetic. Stay and die, or run and maybe not. She'd chosen maybe. The second hour the trail began to mean it. Switchbacks cut across the mountain's face, each bend revealing more vertical climb ahead and less of the valley below. Wind sharpened from the northwest and started testing her balance on patches of black ice, hiding under fresh powder the way certain intentions hide under hospitable manners. Rose shifted her weight forward, kept moving. She had stopped having options 6 weeks ago. That was when she'd seen the advertisement in a Silver City newspaper, sitting on a narrow bed in a rooming house that didn't ask for names because its clientele preferred it that way. She hadn't been searching for anything. She'd been existing, which was all she'd managed for 2 months. Moving from temporary room to temporary town before anyone could start connecting the face to the description on the notice she knew was out there. The advertisement had been buried in the back pages. Small, sparse, the kind of language a careful man would use. Wanted, bride for frontier homesteader, remote location, hard work required, marriage of convenience, inquiries to Samuel Hardin, Settlers Fork, Idaho Territory. Most women would have read warning in those spare words. Remote, hard work, convenience. The pointed absence of anything warmer. Rose had read something else entirely. Meant invisible. Hard work meant she'd be expected to contribute rather than perform gentleness she didn't have. Marriage of convenience meant no one would press her for explanation she couldn't safely give. And Samuel Hardin's reputation. She'd learned it immediately upon asking the telegraph operator about the address. Watched the man's eyebrows rise. Heard the stories about the man on Savage Mountain who went through brides like seasons, meant that no hunter with any professional sense would think to look for her there. Who hides with the monster? Nobody. That was precisely the point. She'd sent a telegram. Received a response within 2 days along with travel money and a single sentence of agreement. 1 month. Either party may withdraw. SH. 1 month of not running. 1 month of somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Now here she was. Third hour. The real cold. The kind that worked through layers and found you regardless of how many you'd worn. Her lungs ached with each breath, the air simultaneously too thin and too sharp. Her legs had passed tired and entered a state past it that didn't have a useful name. Rose didn't slow down. Pain was information. This pain said she was moving. Still vertical. Still here, that was enough. Fourth hour. The edge of exhaustion brought strange things to the periphery of her vision. Shadows that moved like men with guns. Tree shapes that weren't there when she looked at them directly. His phone never stopped ringing. Her mind had been manufacturing threats for months and hadn't learned to stop when the immediate situation didn't require it. She'd grown accustomed to this, treating the mind's productions the way you treat noise in old walls. It's there. It means nothing. Just the structure settling. She ignored the shadows and climbed. And then, somewhere in the fifth hour, moving through darkness, with only the moon's reflection off snow to navigate by, a patch of ice hid under 3 inches of fresh powder. And her left boot found it with the specific bad luck of someone the mountain had decided to test. The world tipped. No gradual warning. Just the instant geometry of a body on an angled surface with nothing beneath it. Gravity claiming her with both hands. The rifle slamming against her spine as she went sideways. And she threw herself toward the rock face, both hands reaching for anything. The outcrop she'd registered 2 minutes earlier, without consciously noting why. Her palms hit granite, her fingers caught, her left shoulder screamed with the kind of pain that lights up a whole side and doesn't quiet. She hung, below, darkness without a visible bottom. She couldn't gauge the drop, 10 feet or 100. Both answers led to the same place. She'd survived Douglas Calloway. She was going to survive this. The thought arrived without drama. Simply true. She pulled herself up inch by inch, ignoring the shoulder, ignoring the blood working through her gloves, from where the rock had taken skin. When her chest cleared the edge, then her hips, then her legs, she lay flat on solid ground and stared up at the Idaho sky for 4 counted seconds. Snow fell straight down onto her upturned face. The mountain was perfectly silent. 4 seconds. Then she stood, checked the rifle, scratched but sound. Checked the pack, intact. Checked her direction, still up. She kept climbing. The cabin appeared the way things appear at the end of long effort. Suddenly, without fanfare, as though it had been there all along, waiting for her to prove herself sufficient before revealing itself. It sat in a clearing where the trees had pulled back. She couldn't tell if they'd retreated or been driven, and it was nothing like she'd imagined. Bigger. The walls noticeably thicker than practical necessity required. Windows placed at angles and heights that had nothing to do with light or view, and everything to do with sightlines. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, no movement in the clearing. Not a home someone had built to live in, a position someone had built to hold. She approached with the rifle at ready. Not raised, but ready, her hand loose on the grip, her eyes moving in the pattern she'd developed over 2 years of sleeping with one ear always open. She was 20 feet from the door when it opened. The man in the doorway was backlit by a lantern inside, which gave her his silhouette before she had his face. The silhouette established several facts in rapid sequence. He was 6'2" at minimum. His shoulders occupied most of the doorframe without effort or self-consciousness. And he moved. Even standing still, he moved, with the particular stillness of something that had learned patience not as a virtue, but as a tool. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "You're early." His voice had the sound of something that didn't get exercised often enough. Deep, rough at the edges in the way of gravel that's been there a long time. Plans changed. Rose didn't lower the rifle from ready. Didn't raise it either. "You're Samuel Hardin?" "I am." They stood measuring each other across 20 feet of frozen ground, while snowflakes fell between them, which was both appropriately dramatic and genuinely cold. "You going to invite me in?" Rose's voice came out steadier than her shoulder felt. "Or do we conduct the entire arrangement, standing in the snow?" Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, but the distant memory of one, surfacing briefly. "Contract's already legal as far as the territory's concerned. Your acceptance telegram, my travel money, that's binding enough for government work out here. So what happens now? Now you come inside or you go back down. Your choice." She started forward. I didn't climb 5 hours in the dark to stand at the threshold. She expected him to move aside as she approached. He didn't, just stood there, requiring her to angle through the doorway, with her shoulder passing within inches of his chest. A test. She recognized tests. She'd been given versions of them by men her whole adult life. How much would she give up without being asked? How much space would she surrender before he even reached for it? She surrendered none. Her shoulder made contact with his chest, and she felt him go rigid, with the specific stiffness of someone not accustomed to closeness, that didn't carry fear in it. She noted that, moved past it. Inside, the cabin was not what she'd expected. She'd braced herself for squalor or deliberate intimidation. What she found was order. Severe, stripped of anything decorative, organized with the logic of someone who'd thought carefully about how to move through a space in an emergency. Heavy furniture, handmade, and placed without wasted clearance. A fireplace large enough to heat the entire main room efficiently. 2 rifles above the mantel, positioned for access rather than display, both with the set of their locks indicating they were loaded. Samuel Hardin closed the door behind her. The bar across it was solid timber. In the lantern light, she got her first complete read of him. 42 years old, which she'd known from the correspondence. He looked like what 42 feels like when it has included a war, years of isolation, and something else she couldn't yet identify. Something harder to name than the obvious things. His face held scars at the jaw and brow, old enough to be part of the landscape of him, rather than recent damage. Dark hair gone gray at the temples. Eyes that moved constantly, measuring distances, angles, the space between one thing and the next. Not frightening, though he was that. Not cold, though he was that also. The word that came to her was used, like something put to hard purpose for many years and long since finished pretending to be anything else. You can take the loft, he said. No preamble, no softening. I sleep down here. Blankets in the trunk up there. Water barrels by the door, refilled each morning. Outhouse 30 feet east. Kitchen is shared. Cook what you need when you need it. I don't expect you to cook for me. Rose raised an eyebrow. No rules beyond that? One rule. His eyes found hers and held them, and the look carried something deliberate. The boy is off limits. The room changed. She felt it before she understood it. A new weight in the air, a shift in the quality of the silence. Rose's hand moved toward the rifle and stopped. What boy? He didn't answer with words. He tilted his chin upward, slightly, enough, and then she heard it. From above. Not from the loft where she was meant to sleep, but higher, from the shadows of the peaked rafters above the main room. A sound like weight redistributing. Like something careful and practiced choosing to move. She looked up, at first. Only the geometry of support beams and old timber in the dim light. Then her eyes adjusted and she found what was there. A child. Pressed into the highest corner where wall met ceiling. Small enough to fit into a space no child his age should have been able to occupy. Wild dark hair hanging across his face. Clothing that had been clothing once and was now something else. A shirt beyond recognition. Pants held up with a length of rope. No shoes. His feet wrapped in strips of cloth so dirty, the original color was anybody's guess. And his eyes, even from 15 feet below, in poor light, she could see what was in them. Not the eyes of a 7-year-old. Not the eyes of someone who had grown up with ordinary protections around him. These were the eyes of a creature that had learned the world exclusively through its dangers and had organized everything it knew around that education. That's Owen. Samuel's voice had changed, lost some of its roughness, which somehow made it more difficult to hear. He's been with me 8 months. Doesn't speak. Doesn't come down while I'm awake. Doesn't trust anyone. Rose didn't look away from the child. The child didn't look away from her. Where did he come from? Found him in a root cellar. Homestead about 10 miles north. The family was gone. Evidence of a raid, but the details didn't add up clearly. Could have been anyone. He said this with the flatness of someone who had examined the facts many times and found them unchanged each time. He'd been there for, I don't know exactly how long. Long enough. I brought him back? Why? The pause that followed was not the pause of someone without an answer. It was the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. Because I couldn't leave him there. No decoration on it. No request for credit. Just the bare fact. The brides, Rose said. This is what drove them away. Some left because of me. The rest left because of Owen. They'd try for a day or two. They'd see that he wouldn't come down. That he'd attack if anyone got too close. That he stole food and cached it in the rafters. That he made sounds at night that they couldn't explain or ignore. Samuel stopped. I don't blame them for leaving. Rose was still watching Owen in the rafters. Owen was still watching her back. She had the immediate, wordless impression that she was being assessed. Not the way an adult assesses a stranger, but the way a creature assesses a potential threat. Running calculations that were entirely about safety. Entirely about whether this new variable was a danger or a category of danger that could be accommodated. She understood that kind of looking. She'd done it herself. She'd done it in the mirror. I'm not most women, she said. Samuel's expression carried something that wasn't quite skepticism. They all say that. No, She turned to face him directly. They say it because they hope it's true. I say it because I know what I am, and I know exactly why I'm here, and I'm not confused about either one. She stood her ground the way she'd learned to stand it. Not aggressive, not apologetic, simply immovable. I didn't come here to be a mother. I didn't come to save anyone or soften anyone or perform warmth I don't have. I came because I need to disappear and you need someone who won't run. That's the whole transaction. I'll work, hunt, cook, whatever this place requires. But I don't do gentle. If you have a problem with what I am, say it now. Samuel looked at her for a long time. The kind of look that was trying to read something. No problem, he said. Good, she looked around the cabin. Where do I put my gear? Wherever you want. She moved toward the ladder to the loft. Was halfway up when his voice came from below, quieter now, with a precision that said he was being careful. The others lasted anywhere from 12 hours to 9 days. When you leave, I'm not leaving. She didn't turn around. Whatever you've got up here, whatever sent those 24 women back down, it's not worse than what I'm running from. That's not bravery. That's arithmetic. Down there I'm dead. Up here I might not be. So I'm staying. She climbed the rest of the way up without waiting for his response. In the main room below, Samuel Hardin stood still and looked at the space where she'd been. After a moment he looked up at the rafters where Owen still crouched. Different one, he said quietly. To no one. To both of them. Owen didn't respond. He never did. But his eyes had tracked from the spot where Rose had stood to the loft entrance where she'd gone. And Samuel, who had spent 8 months studying that child's face in the way you study the only text available to you, thought he saw something there that wasn't the usual calculations. Just watching. The watching of something that hadn't decided yet. Rose didn't sleep that first night. The loft was simple. A straw mattress, 2 shelves, a small window that showed nothing but snowfall and darkness. She lay fully dressed with the rifle within arm's reach and listened to the cabin around her. Not anxiously. Methodically, cataloging each sound the way you catalog a new space, when staying alive in it might someday matter. Samuel moved below. She heard him cross to the fireplace, stir the embers, add wood. Heard the particular creak of his chair. He'd gone to sit rather than sleep, which meant she wasn't the only person in this cabin who didn't sleep easily. The fire settled. Outside, wind tested the walls and found them adequate. Above everything else, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, Owen moved in the rafters. He was skilled at silence. Barely any sound. His phone never stopped ringing. But Rose had spent 2 years developing the habit of hearing things that were trying not to be heard. The approach of a floorboard's whisper. The shift in air pressure that announced someone on the other side of a door. The barely there rustle of fabric. The barely as her early warning served as her early solving system during the years she'd needed one. She'd developed these habits because her life had made them necessary for the most basic of reasons. So she tracked Owen's movements. Heard him work along the support beams overhead. Heard him pause above the loft entrance, probably looking down at her, probably running the same calculations she'd seen in his downstep, testing the new variable. Deciding, Rose lay still and breathed evenly and let him decide. After a while he retreated. Back to the highest corners, the parts of the rafters, where he could observe everything and be observed by nothing. A strategy she recognized. She'd had her own version of it in a different kind of house somewhere below this mountain. In the valley and beyond it, there were people looking for her. She was certain of this the way she was certain of things that had been thought through carefully rather than hoped away. Douglas Calloway had been wealthy. His family had money and connections sufficient to fund a prolonged search, and the wound of it. A wife who had refused the terms of a final confrontation was not the kind of thing a family like theirs absorbed quietly. A bounty notice had gone out within the month after she'd left Colorado. His phone never stopped ringing. She'd heard a man, a Salt Lake City dining room who'd been careless enough to describe it to a stranger at the next table, without considering whether the stranger might be relevant. $5,000. Substantial. The kind of number that made professional men commit to uncomfortable work. Someone would come north, eventually. The question was when. She'd known this when she'd answered the advertisement. She'd climbed this mountain anyway, because Samuel Hardin's reputation, a man so formidable that 24 women had fled him, was exactly the kind of deterrent that made this cabin the last place a bounty hunter with any professional judgment would think to search. Who hides with the monster? Nobody. And because down in the valley she was already as good as caught. Up here the math was different. Toward dawn, Samuel moved below, added wood to the fire, went to the door, opened it briefly, cold air pressing up even through the loft floor, then closed it again. Breakfast in an hour, his voice from below, level, not demanding. Information delivered. The voice of a man who communicated in facts rather than feelings, because feelings were a language. He'd stopped trusting himself to speak accurately. Rose said nothing. But she was listening. She lay for another few minutes, taking the full measure of the cabin's sounds, where the floor creaked, how the walls breathed in wind, the acoustics that would tell her, over time, where people were, and what they were doing without requiring her to see them. These were the habits she'd built over 2 years of necessary attention. She couldn't dismantle them in a single night. She wasn't sure she'd want to, even if she could. Then she sat up, stretched the muscles that ached from the climb and from a tension she hadn't yet figured out how to release. Checked the rifle. Checked the knives. Both of them, belt and boot. Checked the ammunition in her coat pocket. Not because she expected to need any of it this morning, because checking was how she started every day now. The ritual that said, "Today begins on my terms." She climbed down to start the first full day on Savage Mountain. The day the men in Pete Garner's saloon had bet she'd spend running. Breakfast was salt pork, fried potatoes, coffee strong enough to sand wood. Samuel cooked with no wasted motion and no conversation, the way a man cooks when he's been cooking for one for years, and has made his peace with the efficiency of silence. The food was fuel, the preparation a task to be completed. Rose ate standing up, her back against the wall, where she could see both the front door and the ladder to the loft. Samuel took his plate to the chair by the fire, and sat without comment on her position. He understood something about the need to watch exits, she suspected, or he was polite enough not to make an issue of things that weren't his business. "You didn't sleep?" she said, because it was relevant information. "Not much." He ate methodically. "Rarely do. What keeps you up?" He looked at his coffee. "Many things, the boy. Among others." Rose looked up at the rafters. No sign of Owen now, but the weight of attention was there. She could feel the difference between an empty room and a room with eyes in it. She'd spent enough time in both to know. "Does he eat?" she asked. "When neither of us is watching, he takes from the stores and cashes it up there. I leave extra out at night. It's gone by morning. Have you tried to bring him down?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He set his fork down with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words. "Once, in the beginning, I thought direct contact might communicate something that patience couldn't. A pause with something jagged in it. He bit through my hand. 3 stitches. After that I decided to let him come to things at his own pace. Wise. Rose meant it. Force doesn't communicate safety. It communicates that the person applying it has decided their agenda is more important than your readiness." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite curiosity, and wasn't entirely suspicion. "I know what it costs when someone decides their timing matters more than yours." She kept it simple. Let it sit without elaboration. The silence that followed had a texture different from the one before. The kind that comes after something truer than expected has been said, and both parties are deciding what to do with it. Samuel stood and pulled on his coat. Bare hide over wool, made for function rather than impression. "Trap line runs 3 miles north along the ridge. I'll be back before dark, leaving me here." "Alone with him? You said you weren't leaving. You said you could manage." He picked up his rifle. The look he gave her was measuring something. "Was that accurate, or were you filling silence?" She almost smiled. "Almost. Go check your traps." He paused at the door. "The rifle above the mantel is loaded. So is the one on the left wall. I have my own." Something in his tone shifted. Not approval exactly, but the acknowledgement that what he'd assessed was turning out to be what it appeared. "There are trappers in these mountains this time of year. Most are decent. Some aren't. If you go outside." "I understand. I'm not certain you do. This isn't Colorado." He said it without inflection. A statement of fact rather than a warning. But the mention of Colorado, specific, deliberate, told her he knew something, not everything. "But something I'll manage," Rose said. He left. The door sealed behind him, with the sound of something heavy being closed. Rose stood in the main room and counted to 60, listening to his footsteps diminish across the clearing and into the trees. When she was certain of the distance, she looked up. Owen was there. Of course he was. Perched on a beam directly above the kitchen area, partly concealed behind a vertical support, his face a pale shape in the overhead shadows. His breathing was audible from down here. Quick and shallow, the breathing of something that had been found and was running calculations. "I'm not going to hurt you." She said it without softening, without the exaggerated gentleness people used with damaged things, which was itself a kind of condescension. "Just information. And I'm not going to try to make friends with you. I'm going to be here, doing what needs doing. You can come down or stay up there. That's entirely up to you." Nothing moved in the rafters. Rose turned her back on him and started on the breakfast dishes. Every survival instinct she had objected. Don't expose your back to an unknown. But she understood, with a certainty that came from somewhere older than calculation, that keeping him in sight was exactly the wrong approach. That was predator behavior. She was not hunting him. She washed plates in cold water from the barrel, scrubbed the pan with sand and rag. Ordinary sounds. Behind her, nothing audible. Then, after several minutes, the smallest possible sound. Weight shifting, fabric brushing wood, getting closer. She kept washing. More time. The sound of breathing, closer now. Close enough to distinguish from her own. Rose turned slowly. Owen stood 8 feet away. Crouched with his weight on his toes, every muscle coiled for the sprint, back to the nearest vertical surface. His clothes were worse than they'd appeared from above. The shirt was barely a shirt. The pants held up by knotted rope. His feet wrapped in cloth strips, coming loose at the ends. His face was too thin, in the way that wasn't a feature but a condition. The sharpness of someone whose bones had been inadequately cushioned for too long. Scars on his forearms, thin white lines, old enough to be part of him but young enough to tell their story clearly. "You're hungry," Rose said. Flat. Not a question and not a demand. His eyes moved to the stove and back to her face. Leftover potatoes in the pan. Half the pork is still there. She turned, reached across, pushed the pan to the stove's edge, within arm's reach of anyone standing on the floor. Then she moved away, took up the dishcloth, began wiping down the already clean counter. She did not watch him. That was the important part. Watching was hunting. And she was not hunting. Silence. Then, the whisper of feet on floorboards, quick and deliberate. The sound of the pan being moved. Then nothing. When she turned back, Owen was gone. The pan was licked clean, smart. Don't hesitate. Don't assume the opportunity will last longer than the moment. His phone never stopped ringing. Rose looked at the empty pan and thought about the months she'd spent secreting crackers in the lining of her winter coat. The dried fruit she'd kept in a pouch inside her boot, the meals eaten fast, and in silence whenever Douglas had left the house. Never certain when the next opportunity might come, never trusting that the normal rules applied. You ate when you could. You stored what you could store. You never believed the good circumstance would hold. She understood Owen's math entirely. It was the same math she'd been running for 2 years. She put the pan away and began a systematic review of the cabin. If she was going to stay, and she was, she'd said so, and she'd meant it. She needed to know the space, exits, weapons, supply locations, the logic of how the man who built this place had thought about it. Front door, heavy timber with an interior bar. One entrance, tactically constraining, but also one location to defend. The odd window placement made full sense now. Not for light or view, for sightlines on the approaches. The rifles above the mantel, she checked both. Loaded, clean, maintained by someone who treated weapons the way professionals did. Shelves, substantial reserves. Flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, smoked meat on hooks. Medical supplies in a wooden box. Real ones, not decorative. More ammunition than most households, stored dry and accessible. A bottle of whiskey pulling double duty as comfort and antiseptic. She was examining a set of traps in the corner. Large ones built for something that needed serious restraint, when she heard it outside. Hoofbeats, multiple rows went still. 3 horses, she assessed from the sound, approaching at a steady pace. Not trying for quiet, either confidence or carelessness, and the distinction mattered. She moved to the window and cracked the shutter just enough. 3 men on horseback working through the snow with the care of good riders unfamiliar with this specific terrain. Their clothing was too deliberate for trappers. Their posture carried the practiced authority of men, accustomed to doors opening when they knocked. The man at the front, tall, lean, face readable from 50 yards as belonging to someone who thought in terms of leverage. Something metal on his chest caught the pale winter light. A badge. Rose's stomach did a specific thing. The thing it did when she'd managed not to think about something, and the something had decided to stop waiting. She stepped back from the window, assessed the room. 3 options, none of them clean, she could hide. But they'd seen the chimney smoke, they knew someone was here. She could try to run, but through what, to where, and leaving Owen alone in the cabin. Or she could do the third thing, the hardest thing, the thing that required her to become someone else for as long as it took. She set her rifle down. Not far, never far, but away from her hands. Adjusted her coat so the knife handles weren't immediately visible. Smoothed her hair with her fingers. By the time the knock came, 3 solid impacts, the knock of men who expected compliance. She had become, as best she could manage on 2 minutes' notice, a frontier wife interrupted in the middle of her morning. She opened the door. The tall man recalibrated visibly. He'd expected Hardin. "Ma'am?" He touched his hat brim with the performance of courtesy. "Sorry to disturb. Name's Wade Colton. We're tracking a fugitive through this territory. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" His eyes were already moving past her, reading the room, doing exactly what she'd been doing 15 minutes ago. "Happy to help if I can," Rose said. "Though I've only been here a few days myself. Haven't seen anyone except my husband, your husband." "That'd be Samuel Hardin?" "That's right. Heard about him in Settlers Fork." The pause before what came next was too precise to be casual. "Heard he goes through brides the way most men go through weather. You must be number 25. "I must be." She held his gaze with the expression she'd spent 2 years constructing. Present, slightly confused, entirely harmless. "I'm the exception. Is that so?" Colton's smile didn't engage anything above the level of his mouth. "Mind if we come in?" "Long ride up that trail." A few minutes by the fire. Of course she stepped back, because refusing would have been the wrong calculation. Better to control what happened inside than prevent them from entering and lose control entirely. They came in. All 3 of them, Colton and 2 others. The second man carried a scar that split his left eyebrow and gave his face a permanent cast of skepticism. The third was younger, better looking, with the eyes of someone who understood that his appearance was an asset and had made his peace with deploying it. All 3 moved with the practiced efficiency of men who position themselves in rooms for professional reasons. Clear sightlines to every corner. Clear path to the door. "Coffee?" Rose offered, because that was what a frontier wife offered. That'd be kind. Colton settled into Samuel's chair with the ease of a Samuel's chairs with the ease of a man who sat in specifically to establish something about who was in charge of the room. His eyes continued their inventory of the cabin. Over the rifles on the wall, over the shelves, over the ladder to the loft. Rose poured from the pot on the stove, handed out 3 cups. Her hands did not shake. She'd built that reliability over a long time, and she drew on it now. "Fugitive we're after," Colton said. "Murder charge out of Colorado. Woman who killed her husband. Wealthy man, connected family. There's a significant reward for information leading to her return." "How terrible," Rose said. "The appropriate register. Not too much, not too little." Douglas Calloway. Owned mining operations in Clear Creek County. His wife put a knife in him and ran. Colton looked at his coffee, then looked up at her. "They say it wasn't self-defense. They say she wanted what was his. The name. Her dead husband's name. Spoken in this cabin, in the place she'd climbed through darkness and bleeding hands to reach precisely because it was the last place anyone would look. Spoken by a man who was watching her face for a reaction to it." Rose held her expression. The effort was not small. He hadn't connected it yet. He was watching for the flinch, the recognition, the involuntary tell, and she hadn't given him one. He was still running the probability. Woman who arrived recently. Matches the general shape of the description. Could be anyone, or he was smarter than that, and was watching to what she did, with the rope he was letting out. "If I encounter anyone matching that description," Rose said, measured, "I'll make sure my husband sends word down to Settlers Fork." "Appreciate that." Colton set his cup down. "Though while we're here, any objection if we take a look around?" "Just being thorough." "Look around for what exactly?" "Fugitives leave traces, personal items, papers." He spread his hands into a gesture of reasonableness. "Women tend to hold on to things." The man with the scarred eyebrow had already drifted toward the far shelves. The younger one moved toward the ladder to the loft. Rose stepped into his path. Not aggressively. Just present, just there. "I'd prefer you didn't." Quiet. The specific kind of quiet that isn't softness. The younger man stopped. Looked at Colton. Colton's expression changed. The performance of courtesy dropped away and left something more direct. "We have authorization from the territorial governor's office. That authority covers search of premises when we have cause to believe." "Your guest's in my husband's home," Rose said. "He's not here to speak for himself, so I'll speak for him. He won't be pleased to come back and find strangers going through his property." She met Colton's eyes without moving. "You've heard the stories about Samuel Hardin. I imagine everyone in this territory has. I'd think carefully about whether your authorization is worth what happens when he walks through that door." A pause. She watched him weigh it. Samuel Hardin's reputation as a variable. The stories. The question of whether $5,000 was worth a confrontation with a man whose name alone made people in Settlers Fork speak more carefully. "We'll be going," Colton said. He holstered nothing. He hadn't drawn anything. But he stood with the exaggerated deliberateness of a man demonstrating that the movement was his choice. "But we'll be back." If we find there's more here than what's visible today, you'll find a wife keeping her home, Rose said. Nothing more interesting than that. Colton's eyes held hers for a beat too long. We'll see about that, ma'am. They left. His phone never stopped ringing. Rose stood at the window and watched them through the cracked shutter until they were through the tree line, and the hoofbeats dissolved into the mountain's indifferent silence. Then she sat down in Samuel's chair and allowed her hands to do what they'd been waiting to do. Trembled. Just for a minute. Just long enough for the adrenaline to move through and leave her with the flat, clear-eyed state that followed survived things. He would come back. She knew it with the certainty of someone who understood how men like Colton operated. He had a lead. He had a suspicion. He'd come back with more men and fewer pretenses, and she needed to be ready for that conversation. From above. Movement. She looked up. Owen descended from the rafters. Not slowly, quickly, the practiced movement of someone who'd made that descent in darkness many times. He landed in a crouch on the floor and looked at her. Something in his calculation had changed. She could see it in the weight of his attention. He crossed to within 5 feet of her chair. The closest he'd come to anyone, she suspected, since long before Samuel found him. He reached out one small hand and touched the knife handle at her belt. One finger, testing the reality of it. Then he looked up at her face. The question was entirely clear without any words to carry it. Will you use it if they come back? Yes, Rose said. If it comes to that, Owen withdrew his hand, stepped back 2 paces, and then he did something he had not done once in 8 months on this. Instead of climbing back to the rafters, instead of retreating to the high ground he'd chosen over every other option available to him, he went to the corner behind the woodbox and sat down, watchful, wary, ready to move at the first wrong signal, but down, on the ground. At her level it wasn't trust. She wasn't enough of a fool to call it trust, but it was the earliest possible edge of something. The tiny sliver of willingness to consider whether trust might eventually be possible, which was not the same as trust, but was the only ground from which trust could ever grow. When Samuel returned 2 hours later and Rose told him what had happened, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood very still for a moment. Then he went to the trunk in the corner and took out a gun belt with 2 holstered revolvers. Checked them with the deliberateness of someone who checked weapons, because checking weapons was what kept you alive, not because he was performing readiness. Strapped them on. You used my reputation against him, Samuel said. It was practical. He looked at her, then at Owen in his corner, then back at her, with something in his expression that hadn't been there in the morning. Not warmth. Earlier than warmth. The acknowledgement that what he was looking at was not what he'd expected to find. All right, he said. He moved to the table, opened the trunk under the window, and produced a map. Spread it flat. The marks on it were dense and old. This was not a document prepared tonight. We should talk about what happens when they come back. Rose pulled the kitchen stool to the table and sat across from him. And on the map between them, all the approaches to this mountain, and all the places where the ground gave one kind of person an advantage over another. She began to see the shape of what they were going to have to do. The storm hit on the 4th day after Rose arrived. Not gradually. Not with the courtesy of warning. The way all honest things arrive. All at once, filling every available space until nothing remained that wasn't storm. A white wall moved in from the west and consumed the horizon in under 15 minutes. The wind shifted from nuisance to threat between one breath and the next. The temperature dropped. With the specific efficiency of something that had been waiting for permission. Rose stood at the window and watched it come and thought. Good, because Wade Colton was somewhere down that mountain, with his bought badge and his careful eyes, and his very specific interest in her face. And even men like Colton, patient, professional, motivated by money rather than emotion, didn't ride through a December blizzard on Savage Mountain for $5,000. Not when the mountain itself became the primary danger. Samuel appeared at her shoulder. Not close, just near enough to see what she was seeing. Weak, he said. Maybe more before the trail is passable. Colton can't get up in this. Nobody can. She let out a breath she'd been holding since the moment 3 horses had appeared at the tree line. The relief was physical, moved through her like something warm finding cold places. She didn't let it show, because showing it meant admitting the size of the fear she'd been managing, and she wasn't ready to do that with a man she'd known for 4 days. Gives us time, Samuel said. Time for what? He walked to the table without answering. The map was already there. She hadn't seen him unfold it, which meant he'd been thinking about this before she'd finished exhaling. He spread his palms flat on the edges and studied it the way someone studies a thing they've studied many times and are still finding new information in. When the weather breaks, he said, they'll come in force. More men, better prepared. They'll have talked to people in town. Gathered what they could, a pause that had weight in it. They'll know who you are by then. Rose looked at the map, at the marks she'd noticed on her first morning. Dense notations at 3 points along the main trail, elevation markers, distance calculations, position circles at 2 locations she now understood were defensible ground, and one notation near the narrowest section of the main trail, written in cramped handwriting that had made these marks a long time ago. Here, you've been planning this for years, she said. Since I found Owen, he said it without drama. Someone killed that family and left no child's body. When no body turned up, they'd eventually come looking. I preferred to be ready for that conversation, and Rose thought, there it was. Not just her problem, not just Colton and $5,000, and the Calloway family's wounded pride that a woman had refused to die quietly when asked. There was Owen's problem layered underneath. 8 months of a child living in the rafters, while a man with bad dreams and good instincts prepared. Alone, for the day someone came to collect what they thought they were owed. We make it costly, Samuel said. Make them calculate whether the price is worth paying. You're talking about defending your home. I'm talking about surviving. He pointed to the notation on the map. Here, where the trail narrows between the 2 rock faces. 300 yards of single file. They can't spread out, can't flank effectively. We position above and below. They enter, we take the lead riders before they understand the geometry. Whatever's left either retreats or advances across open ground. Rose leaned over the map. The narrow section, she knew it exactly. She'd nearly died on the ice just east of it, hanging from a granite outcrop by bleeding hands, while the drop below her remained unmeasured. She remembered the configuration of the rock faces, the way the trees pulled back on both sides, the long sightline down the approach. Here, she said. She put her finger on the western rock face, above the trail. Coming up, I noticed a ledge about 15 feet above the path, protected from below by the overhang. You can't see it from the trail unless you're specifically looking for it. Clear sightline, down the approach for at least 300 yards. Samuel looked at where her finger rested. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, something more like recalibration. You were reading the terrain on the way up. I read terrain everywhere I go now. She kept it simple. The ledge, I can reach it faster than you can. The position gives crossfire with wherever you set up below. He studied the map for a moment. The fallen log at the east edge. Right side of the trail as they approach. Enough cover for rifle work, close enough to the tree line to fall back into if the position is compromised. Simultaneous fire on the lead riders. Before they've stopped to assess, yes, and after? After depends on what they do. He looked at her. If they don't retreat, we fall back to the cabin and make them cross the clearing. Rose straightened. They'd have to expose themselves for 40 yards of open ground. It'll be close work either way. No clean version of this. Rose thought about an October night in Colorado, the weight of a familiar knife in her hand. The look on Douglas Calloway's face in the moment he understood that the woman he'd spent 2 years reducing had not, in fact, been reduced. He'd looked surprised. Not angry, not afraid, surprised. As though the idea that she had a limit and had found it had simply never occurred to him as a possibility. I've been in close work before, she said. He looked at her. The kind of looking that was past the surface read, past the calculation of what she was or wasn't capable of. Looking at her the way you look at something when you're finally seeing it without any of the assumptions you brought to it. Yes, he said. I think you have. 7 days the storm locked them in. 7 days of wind that tested the cabin's construction with the seriousness of an examination. 7 days of snow so complete that the window might as well have been boarded over. 7 days of 3 people. 1 large quiet man with bad nights. 1 woman who had spent years taking up as little space as possible. And 1 small child in the rafters who had organized his entire existence around not being found. Learning to exist in the same air without catastrophe. It wasn't graceful. Real things rarely are at the beginning. The routine assembled itself without negotiation cused, which was the only honest way it could have assembled, between people who didn't yet know how to negotiate with each other. Samuel checked the structure each morning, made a circuit of the walls, tested the roof supports, cleared the snow building up against the doorway before it could seal them in. Rose maintained the fire, and reorganized the food stores, with the methodical attention of someone who understood that knowing exactly what you had was a different kind of safety than hoping things would be sufficient. She counted, dated, arranged by use priority. And Owen started helping, not when asked, not when directed. When he noticed, on the third morning of the storm, Rose turned from the fire and found the wood box filled. She hadn't filled it. Samuel was on the roof, clearing accumulation from the chimney cap. Owen was visible as a shape in the overhead shadows above the kitchen area, utterly motionless, performing invisibility with fierce concentration. She didn't look at him, didn't thank him, didn't make the moment any larger than it could survive being made. She simply noted that the wood box was full, moved to the stove and continued with the morning. An hour later, Samuel came down, looked at the wood box, looked up at the ceiling, looked at Rose. She gave a small headshake. Don't. He poured coffee and said nothing, which was exactly right. The days developed their own shape inside the larger shapelessness of the storm. In the mornings, practical work, maintenance, cooking, the constant management of what the cold and the cabin required of them. In the afternoons, the particular quality of forced proximity that either destroyed people or built something else, depending on what the people were made of. They talked. Not much. His phone never stopped ringing. But more than Rose would have predicted from a man who seemed to have decided that most things worth saying had already been said, and most things not worth saying didn't benefit from being spoken. On the fourth afternoon, his phone never stopped ringing, with the wind doing its worst against the north wall, and the fire doing its best against everything. Samuel was at the table cleaning a rifle, and Rose was going through the medical supplies, taking inventory in her mind of what they had and what they might need. The silence between them had settled into the comfortable variety, the kind that didn't require filling. "You were a soldier," she said, not a question. She'd seen the way he moved through the cabin, through the clearing, through every space he occupied, the way his eyes swept rooms, the way he stood with his back to solid surfaces without thinking about it. For a few years, he worked the cleaning rod through the barrel with practiced strokes. Long enough? Civil War? Yes. Which side? He looked at her. Does it matter now? She considered that. No. I suppose not. He went back to the rifle. She went back to the medical supplies. The fire talked to itself for a while. "I came back different," he said, without preamble. The way people say things they've been deciding whether to say when they finally decide. Not in ways that were visible on the outside. Nothing dramatic. Just, the inside didn't match the outside anymore. The man who'd gone was gone, and something else was using his name. Rose set down the bandage roll she was refolding. "Your wife left." A pause. 2 years after I came home. She wasn't wrong to. She'd married someone specific. That specific person didn't come back. What came back could do the work of existing, but couldn't do the work of being a husband to a woman who remembered what her husband had been. He set the rifle down, picked up the cloth, began wiping the exterior with the slow care of someone for whom the task was meditative rather than necessary. I built this cabin. Thought distance from everything that required me to be something I wasn't anymore would help, did it? It stopped making things worse. Which was the best I could say for it. He looked at the fire. Then I found Owen, and I couldn't leave him there. So I brought him here, and suddenly I was required to be something again whether I was equipped for it or not. And the brides. 24 attempts to build something that would give Owen what I couldn't give him alone. He turned the cloth over in his hands. I'm not good with people. I'm aware of that. I was better at it before, I think. The war took the part of me that knew how to be easy with other people, and I never found it again. Rose looked at this man across the table, at the careful hands and the scarred face and the scarred face, and the eyes that were always measuring, always accounting for where the danger was going to come from. She thought about what it cost to say what he'd just said. Not much, to look at it from outside. Everything she suspected from inside. "You're not as bad at it as you think," she said. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise.
"You've known me 4 days. I'm a fast reader."
The silence after that had a different quality, not comfortable in the easy sense. Something more like two people who have stopped pretending not to see each other. "What you told me," Samuel said. "About Douglas Calloway. About why you came here." He chose his words with visible care. "I haven't spoken of it to anyone. I won't. I know you won't. How do you know that?" Rose thought about it. "Because you understand what it costs to have a story that other people get to tell without you." He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said at last. "I do know that." On the 5th night of the storm, something shifted. The fire had burned to deep coals, orange-red and steady, putting out the particular warmth that only coals produce. Even, patient, reliable. Samuel sat in his chair. Rose had pulled the kitchen stool closer to the heat. Close enough to feel it, far enough to maintain the architecture of not crowding. Owen was somewhere in the rafters. She could feel his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Rose was cleaning her rifle, not because it needed it. She'd cleaned it 2 days ago. But because it was something to do with her hands that didn't require conversation and didn't look like avoidance. The familiar sequence. Strip, check, oil, reassemble. Repetitive enough to let the mind settle. Purposeful enough to be honest about. She heard the shift of weight above. Small, Owen was watching. She kept working. Spoke without looking up. Voice even, as though she were reading aloud from something factual. This is the barrel. The bullet exits here. If it's fouled, it can misfire, and a misfire out here isn't a problem with a solution nearby. The cleaning rod moved through. This is the breech, where the cartridge seats. The fit matters more than people think. Too loose and you lose accuracy. Too tight and you lose the gun, nothing from above. But the quality of the silence had changed. This is the trigger mechanism. She demonstrated the action slowly, the clean click of it in the firelit room. You squeeze, not pull. Pulling moves the whole gun off target. Squeezing keeps the sight where you put it. Another shift above, closer. She set the rifle on the floor in front of her, sat back, said nothing more. Samuel from his chair had gone very still. She could feel him choosing not to watch. Deliberately keeping his attention on the fire so his presence didn't change what was trying to happen. A minute passed. 2. Then, feet on the ladder, quick and practiced, the descent of someone who had made that route many times in the dark. Owen dropped to the floor in a crouch 7 feet away. His eyes moved between the rifle on the floor and Rose's face with the specific rhythm of someone working through a decision. It's not loaded, Rose said. Can't hurt anyone in that condition. His gaze went to the rifle. Back to her face. Pick it up if you want to. She didn't gesture toward it, didn't lean forward. Just said the words and left them there. 30 seconds, she counted without letting the counting show. Then Owen crossed the remaining distance, crouched beside the rifle, hovered his hand over the stock the way you test unknown heat. Close enough to know, careful enough to be wrong safely. Then he picked it up. That's yours now, Rose said. If you want it. The look Owen turned on her was not a child's look. It was the look of someone much older than 7 trapped in a 7-year-old circumstances, and within it, moving through all the caution and damage and animal wariness, something small and specific and entirely new. A child being told that something belonged to him. Who hadn't known that was a thing that could happen. Yours to keep clean, Rose said. Your responsibility to treat with respect. You never pointed at something you don't intend to shoot. Owen held the rifle in both hands. Looked at it. Looked at her. The question was there without words to carry it. Why? Why are you giving me this? Because you need something that's actually yours, Rose said. And then, because it was true, and she had stopped filtering true things for how they sounded, and because I know what it feels like to go a long time with nothing that belongs to you. From across the room, Samuel's voice came rough and careful. Show him, so Rose did. She walked Owen through the mechanics. Weight distribution. How to seat the stock properly against a small shoulder. How to line up the sights. How to control breathing. All without ammunition. Just the knowledge of how a thing worked, which is its own kind of power when you've been a long time without any. Owen absorbed without speaking. His hands were steadier than she'd expected. Steadier than his age, and his circumstances gave him any right to be. His focus was absolute. The focus was absolute. The focus of someone who had long since had everything stripped away, except the ability to pay attention to what mattered. When they finished, Owen took the rifle to the corner behind the woodbox, set it carefully against the wall, sat down beside it with one hand resting on the stock. He didn't go back to the rafters. He slept that night on the floor, his back against the woodbox, one hand still touching the rifle, the way children sleep when they found something they're not entirely certain will still be there in the morning. Rose watched from across the room and thought. 1 inch. That's what progress looks like when it's real. Not leaps, not transformations. Just 1 inch gained and held. On the morning of the 6th storm day, Rose came down from the loft to find Owen at the table with a piece of old wrapping paper and a stub of charcoal from the fireplace edge. He was drawing with the concentration of someone doing important work. Not art. Documentation. The way you record something you need to confirm is real. She approached slowly. He didn't stop drawing, didn't pull the paper toward himself, the way he would have a week ago. She looked over his shoulder. 3 figures. Stick figures, but specific in their details. The tallest one had marks across its face meant to represent scars, and stood with its feet planted wide. The medium figure had long lines for hair and a shape at its belt. The smallest one held something unmistakably rifle-shaped, At the bottom, in letters that had cost him effort, uneven, labored but clear, family. Something moved in Rose's chest, not breaking. Opening, the way a window opens that's been painted shut for too long. She had come to this mountain armed with arithmetic and the cold logic of mutual necessity, and a very specific plan of not feeling things that weren't useful for survival. She had been quite clear with herself about this, and yet, she put her hand on Owen's shoulder, lightly, ready to withdraw at the first sign it was wrong. He kept drawing. Samuel came down the ladder, stopped in the doorway when he saw them. Didn't speak, didn't move. Did the thing that Rose was learning, was his particular form of emotional expression. Stood completely still, and let what he was seeing register somewhere past the usual defenses. Then he found a nail in the wall near the fireplace, drove it in with a rock he picked up from the hearth, hung the drawing on it, no speech, no ceremony. Just a drawing on a nail on a wall. Which was, Rose thought, exactly the right amount. The night before the fight, none of them slept much. Rose lay in the loft and listened to Samuel below. Not pacing, not moving. Just awake in the way he was awake on difficult nights. Managing whatever the darkness brought him with the quiet endurance of someone who'd been doing it for years. Outside, the wind had dropped entirely. The mountain had gone still with the specific stillness of something that was waiting rather than resting. Sometime after midnight she heard a sound from below that was different from the cabin's usual night vocabulary. She climbed down. Owen was in the corner behind the wood box, his shoulders shaking. His phone never stopped ringing. Not the careful managed crying she'd seen from him before, the kind he'd learned to produce without sound, because sound had been dangerous in whatever situation had preceded Samuel finding him. This was different, the kind of crying that had been stored too long and was no longer willing to be stored. Rose sat down nearby, not close enough to crowd him. Close enough to be there. You know. What's happening tomorrow, she said. Not a question. He didn't deny it. I'm frightened too, she said. Frightened is what happens when you're smart enough to understand what's at stake. It only becomes a problem if it stops you from moving. Owen looked at her through the blur of what he'd been holding. His face was all the things a 7-year-old's face should still have room for. Fear and grief and the exhaustion of a child who'd been required to be braver than his age for far too long. But underneath all of it, moving through the damage and the wariness, she saw something that had been building slowly over days of wood boxes filled and drawings completed and floors slept on instead of rafters. He wanted to believe her. She put her arm around his thin shoulders. He was trembling. Not from cold, the fire was adequate. Just the accumulated weight of everything this child had survived and was about to survive again. She could feel each rib under her hand. We will come back for you, she said. That's not comfort. That's the plan. Owen pressed his face against her arm and let himself cry without managing it. The sound of it was the most honest thing she'd heard in this cabin, and also the most painful, because it was the sound of a child finally trusting that someone could be told about the fear. Samuel, who had been sitting in his chair by the dead fire, stood without speaking and came to crouch nearby. Not touching, he was still careful about that, still learning the geography of contact with people who weren't Owen. But present. Close enough that his presence changed the quality of the air. After a while, Owen quieted. Rose kept her arm where it was until she felt the trembling subside. Then she moved slightly, giving him the choice of distance. He stayed where he was. The three of them sat in the dark cabin on the night before the fight and said nothing more because nothing more needed saying. Outside, the mountain was absolutely still. Before the first gray light, they began to prepare. His phone never stopped ringing. They armed themselves with the systematic thoroughness of people who had thought about this moment and were not surprised by its arrival. Samuel moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and had made a private accounting of what it required of him. Rose matched him, working from her own particular preparation. Years of planning for a confrontation she hadn't known would take this exact shape, but had known in her bones was coming in some shape eventually. When everything was ready, they brought Owen to the cellar entrance. He stood at the edge of it and looked down into the darkness with the expression of someone who understood that this was the right plan and who also was 7 years old and had already spent time in a small dark space while terrible things happened above him. Rose crouched in front of him. Eye level. You know the signal, she said. Our voices. Your name. Nothing else opens that door. Owen nodded. Samuel crouched beside her. He looked at Owen for a long moment. This child he'd found in a root cellar 8 months ago and carried home because he couldn't do otherwise. This child who had lived in his rafters and stolen his food and bitten him hard enough for stitches, and who was now standing at the edge of a cellar with a rifle and 3 rounds and the specific expression of someone doing a brave thing, while being entirely clear-eyed about what brave costs. "When this is done," Samuel said, "we're going to plant a garden." Owen looked at him. "In the spring. You decide what goes in it." Samuel's voice was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something too large for his usual management. "Whatever you want." Owen opened his mouth. Nothing came. He tried again, still nothing, and then, so quiet it barely existed as sound. "Careful," 1 word. 8 months of silence ending in a single careful syllable, delivered in a voice rough from long disuse. Samuel went completely still. The word hung in the cold air of the cabin. Small and real and enormous in proportion to its size. When Samuel spoke, his voice was not entirely steady. "Yeah, we'll be careful," he stood. Looked at Rose once. They closed the cellar door over Owen's head and went out into the dark. The morning was clear and brutally cold. Every surface glittered with the hard beauty of a mountain that had frozen solid in the night. Rose climbed to her position on the western rock face, while enough dark remained to make the movement invisible from below. 15 feet up, protected by the overhang from any sightline from the trail. Clear view down the approach for 300 yards. She settled in, stilled her breathing. Let herself become part of the rock, and the cold and the waiting. Below and to the right, Samuel was at the fallen log at the east edge of the trail. She couldn't see him. That was correct. She waited it. The cold accumulated. The sun climbed, then, hoofbeats. She'd planned for scouts. Colton was professional enough to send 2 riders ahead of the Moutain group to trigger any ambush at distance. And he had. 2 riders came around the lower bend first, 100 yards ahead of the rest, moving carefully through the narrows with their rifles out and their eyes on the rock faces. Rose held completely still. Let them pass beneath her position. Say, close enough to have reached out and touched them. She held her breath and did not move and watched them continue up the trail toward the cabin, where they would find a barred door and an empty clearing and would turn back. Which was when the main group needed to already be in the narrows. She watched the trail below. Counted seconds. The main group appeared around the lower bend 30 seconds after the scouts cleared her position. 7 men. More than Samuel's estimate of 6. Colton at the front. She recognized the lean frame, the badge catching the pale winter light. The scarred eyebrow man on his left. The younger good-looking one on his right. And behind them, 4 men with the faces of people who worked for money and asked no questions about the work. Hired in the days since Colton had scouted the mountain, she understood. He'd gone back to Settler's Fork and the towns beyond it and assembled a sufficient force. They entered the narrows. Rose put her eye to the sights. Found her target. The rearmost hired gun, not Colton, because removing the man at the back removed the option of clean retreat for the rest. She breathed out slowly. Below and to the right, she knew Samuel was doing the same. His target lined up, waiting for the same moment. She squeezed the trigger. 2 shots. 1 echo, the rearmost rider went down. The scarred eyebrow man lurched sideways, hit but not stopped. The horses screamed. The column shattered. Men throwing themselves from saddles, grabbing for cover in a space that hadn't been designed to offer much of it. Colton was already calling orders. Controlled, directional, the voice of someone who'd been in bad situations before and understood that the voice was one of the things you could hold steady when other things weren't. Find them. Both positions. There are only 2 of them. Rose shifted position immediately. She moved laterally along the ledge, low and fast, using the rock face and the pine branches. Found the second firing point she'd chosen 3 days ago. Below, Samuel was firing with deliberate rhythm. 1 shot. Work the mechanism. 1 more shot. The sound of measured effort. The 2 scouts. She heard them before she saw them, their horses crashing back down the trail from the cabin direction as the gunfire reached them. They came around the bend into the chaos of the narrows, and one of Samuel's shots caught the lead scout before he could assess the situation. The second scout wheeled his horse and drove it off the trail into the trees and did not reappear. 6 down, counting the first 2 from the initial volley. 1 fled. That left Colton, the scarred man who'd taken a shoulder wound but was still functional, the younger good-looking one, and 1 remaining hired gun, taking cover behind the rock face on the eastern side. One of Colton's remaining men broke east, trying to flank Samuel's position through the trees. Rose tracked him through the pine branches, let him commit to the route, and put a bullet through his thigh at close range when he thought he'd moved beyond her sight line. He went down in the snow and did not get back up to flank anyone. Pull back, Colton called. Regroup, they went around the curve. She could hear them. The argument, Colton's voice cutting through it, the sounds of men recalculating. Rose reloaded in the pause. Below, Samuel caught her eye around the edge of the log. He pointed toward the bend where Colton's group had retreated and made a questioning motion. She shook her head. Hold. They had elevation and cover. The moment they abandoned those advantages, they were exposed against men who still outnumbered them. He acknowledged it, stayed. The shot came from above and behind her. Not from the trail. From above. From the rock. Colton had sent one man to break off before the retreat, had climbed the eastern approach to the ridge while the rest withdrew, coming over the top to get above Rose's position from behind. A good move. His phone never stopped ringing, the kind that required someone to sacrifice their own safety for the group's gain. The kind that told her Colton had thought about this mountain more carefully than she'd given him credit for. She heard the boot on rock a half-second before the shot, which was why the bullet went past her left ear instead of through it. Rose threw herself flat. The second shot punched through exactly where her head had been. She scrambled backward. Purchase on ice, slid 6 feet before she caught a handhold, heard her rifle skitter sideways and drop into a crevice she could see but not reach. No rifle, knife at her belt, smaller blade in her boot. The arithmetic of a situation that had run out of good options. She pressed herself against the face of the rock below the ledge edge. Waited. His silhouette appeared above. A man she didn't recognize. Rifle aimed at the space where he expected her to be. He adjusted when the space was wrong. Found her. Opened his mouth to call out. Rose launched upward. She drove the smaller blade through his boot into the tendons beneath, grabbed his leg with her free hand, and pulled. He lost the ledge. The fall was 20 feet onto the rocks below, and he did not get up. She scrambled back. Found at the spare rifle she'd placed at the far edge of the ledge before the fight, because she was prepared. And prepared and afraid were genuinely different things. Checked it in 3 seconds. The situation below had changed. Colton's remaining men had used the distraction to rush Samuel's position. 2 men in close with Samuel, his rifle gone somewhere in the snow, a knife in his hand. Fighting with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this before. A 3rd man positioning for a clear shot, but unable to find the angle because Samuel kept moving the 2 men already too close to him. Rose descended the rock face faster than was strictly advisable. Her boots hit the trail and she ran. She shot the man looking for the angle as she came around the fallen log. He dropped. Samuel drove his knife into the man he was grappling with. The man collapsed. Samuel straightened, his left leg. Wrong. Too much blood. Too fast. How bad? Bad enough. Gray in his face. Bullet hit the thigh during the rush. Went through. He was still standing through an act of will she recognized as related to stubbornness, rather than structural integrity. Where's Colton? She turned. Colton stood 15 feet away. Not 50. Not across the clearing. He'd come up behind her while she was running, had circled through the trees along the trail's edge, and emerged close, very close. Close enough that the pistol he'd raised was not aimed across a distance, but aimed across a conversation. 15 feet. The length of a room. His phone never stopped ringing. Close enough that she could see his eyes clearly and read in them the specific calculation of a man who had lost most of his assets, and was determining whether the remaining ones were sufficient. Mrs. Calloway, he said it with the precision of someone confirming what they'd known since the morning they first knocked on her door. It's over, you fought. Well, better than I expect. But it's over. She had the rifle. He had the pistol. 15 feet between them. The boy, Colton continued, Owen Farrow. His uncle wants him back. There's a reward. Smaller than what the Calloway family's offering for you, but combined. You're not going near him, Rose said. His aim shifted slightly, adjusting. The shot came from the tree line 8 feet behind him. Not from distance. From 8 feet. Colton looked down at the hole in his chest, looked up at Rose. The expression on his face was not pain. It was the professional acknowledgement of someone who had failed to account for a variable that had been present the entire time. He fell forward and was still. Rose looked past where he'd been standing. Owen stood at the edge of the tree line, 8 feet behind where Colton had fallen. Both hands on the rifle, both feet planted. The shot had been close. Had to be close, because Owen was 7 years old, and had only learned the mechanics of how the thing worked, and had never fired a live round before this morning, and had understood. Standing in the cellar soning, listening to the sounds of Rose being grabbed by the throat. That close was the only distance at which he could be certain. He'd come out of the concealed exit in the cellar's back wall. The one Samuel had shown him, the one that emerged 30 yards into the trees. He'd circled through the forest, staying in the tree line, moving with the stillness he'd learned in the months before Samuel found him when stillness had been survival. He'd come to within 8 feet of Colton's back before Colton knew he was there. 8 feet. Not 50. 8. The rifle smoke drifted upward in the still air. Owen's hands began to shake. Not during, but after, which was when the body remembered what it had been required to do and sent the invoice. Rose made herself walk. Everything in her body was filing objections, but her body wasn't in charge of this particular moment. She crossed the ground between herself and Owen in measured steps because running would frighten him, and he had already used everything he had. Owen's hands opened. The rifle dropped into the snow. His legs went uncertain, and Rose caught him, both arms, pulled him in, felt him shaking against her with the full-body tremors of someone who had spent everything. He made a sound she hadn't heard from him before, not the managed silence of his previous crying. Not careful, not controlled. A child's sound, unguarded and complete, containing everything the last hour had cost him. "You did what you had to do," Rose said into the top of his head. "You hear me? You kept us here." Behind them, Samuel had gotten himself upright using the rifle as a cane and was crossing the ground toward them with the determined progress of a man for whom the pain was real and currently irrelevant. He stopped beside them. He looked at Owen in Rose's arms. He looked at the tree line where Owen had emerged, 8 feet. The boy had come to within 8 feet. "You did good," Samuel said. His voice had the sound of something compressed for too long finding its release. "Son? You hear me? That took more than I had at your age." Owen pulled back just enough to look at Samuel. His face was all of it at once. The fear and the grief and the exhaustion and, underneath and through all of it, the expression of a child who has been seen accurately by someone who matters to them. Samuel put both hands on Owen's thin shoulders and held on. Rose put her hand on Samuel's arm. He covered it with his. The three of them stood on a mountain trail, with the winter sky going pale, and the cabin visible through the trees, smoke still rising from its chimney, because they'd banked the fire before they left, and the fire had kept. The night before the fight, none of them slept much. Rose lay in the loft and listened to Samuel below. Not pacing, not moving. Just awake in the particular way he was awake, managing whatever the nights brought him with the quiet endurance of someone who'd been doing it a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing. The mountain was so still it felt like it was waiting. Sometime after midnight, she heard a sound from below that was different from the cabin's usual night vocabulary. She climbed down. Owens was in the corner behind the woodbox, his shoulders shaking. Not the careful, silent crying she'd seen from him before, the kind he'd learned to produce without sound, because sound had been dangerous where he'd come from. This was different, harder, the kind of crying that had been waiting longer than a child should have to wait. Not close enough down, crowd him, close enough to be there. "You know what's happening tomorrow," she said. Not a question. He didn't deny it. "I'm frightened too," she said. "Frightened is what happens when you're smart enough to understand what's at stake. It's only a problem if it stops you from moving." Owen looked at her through the blur of what he'd been holding. His face was all the things a 7-year-old's face should still have room for: fear and grief, and the particular exhaustion of a child who'd been required to be braver than his age for far too long. But underneath all of that, she saw something else. Something that had been building slowly over days of wood boxes filled and drawings completed and floors slapped on, instead of rafters. He wanted to believe her. She put her arm around his thin shoulders. He was trembling. Not from cold. The fire was adequate. Just the accumulated weight of everything this child had survived, and was about to survive again. She could feel each rib under her hand. "We will come back for you," she said. "That's not comfort. That's the plan." Owen pressed his face against her arm and let himself cry without managing it. The sound of it was the most human thing she'd heard in this cabin, and also the most painful, because it was the sound hopped as ringing, because it was the sound of a child finally trusting that someone could be told about the fear. Samuel, who had been sitting in his chair by the dead fire, stood without speaking and came to crouch nearby. Not touching, he was still careful about that, still feeling his way toward the geography of contact, but present, close. After a while, Owen quieted, not because the fear was gone, because it had been expressed and had therefore changed form. Rose kept her arm where it was until she felt the shaking subside. Then she moved slightly, giving him the choice of the distance. He stayed where he was. The three of them sat in the dark cabin on the night before the fight and said nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. The fire coals ticked and settled. Outside, the mountain was perfectly still. Before the first gray light, they began to prepare. They armed themselves with the systematic thoroughness of people who had thought about this moment, and were not surprised by its arrival. Samuel moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and had made a private accounting of what it required of him. Rose matched him, working from her own particular preparation. The years of planning for a confrontation she hadn't known would take this exact shape, but had known in her bones was coming in some shape eventually. When everything was ready, they brought Owen to the cellar entrance. He stood at the edge of it and looked down into the darkness, with the expression of someone who understood that this was the right plan, and who also was 7 years old, and had already spent time in a small dark space, while terrible things happened above him. Rose crouched in front of him. Eye level. You know the signal, she said. Our voices. Your name. Nothing else. Owen nodded. Samuel crouched beside her. He looked at Owen for a long moment. This child he'd found in a root cellar 8 months ago, and carried home because he couldn't do otherwise. This child who had lived in his rafters, and stolen his food, and bitten him hard enough for stitches, and who was now standing at the edge of a cellar, with a rifle and 3 rounds. And the particular expression of someone doing a brave thing while being very clear-eyed about what brave costs. When this is done, Samuel said, we're going to plant a garden. Owen looked at him. In the spring. You can decide what goes in it. Samuel's voice was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something too large for his usual management of such thing. Whatever you want. Owen opened his mouth. Nothing came. He tried again, still nothing. And then, so quiet that Rose wasn't certain for a moment she'd heard it. Careful, one word. Barely voiced. 8 months of silence ending in a single careful syllable, delivered in a voice rough from long disuse. Samuel went completely still. The word hung in the cold air of the cabin, small and real and enormous in proportion to its size. When Samuel spoke, it was with the particular roughness of a man managing something that had caught him unprepared. Yeah, we'll be careful. He stood, looked at Rose once. Then they closed the cellar door over Owen's head and went out to meet what was coming. The morning was clear and brutal. Every surface glittered with the aggressive beauty of a mountain that had frozen hard in the night. Rose climbed to her position on the western rock face, while enough dark remained to make the movement invisible from below, 15 feet up. Protected by the overhang from any line of sight from the trail, clear view down the approach for 300 yards. She settled in, stilled her breathing, let herself become part of the rock and the cold and the silence. Below and to the right, Samuel was at the fallen log at the east edge of the trail. She couldn't see him. That was correct. She waited. The cold accumulated. The sun climbed. Ice crystals in the still air caught the light and scattered it into colors that had no business existing in this situation, which was the kind of thing the world did, without reference to whether it was appropriate. Then, hoofbeats, multiple. Coming up the trail at a careful pace, not rushing, taking the switchbacks with deliberate attention. 2 riders ahead of the main group as she'd anticipated. Scouts. She marked them and let them pass beneath her position, close enough to have reached out and touched them, if she'd wanted, and she held absolutely still, and watched them continue up the trail toward the cabin. Then the main group appeared around the lower bend. 7 men, 1 more than the number she'd planned for. Colton at the front, his bought badge catching what light there was. The scarred eyebrow man and the younger good-looking one flanking him. 4 others with the faces of men who worked for money and had made their peace with what money sometimes required. They entered the narrows. Rose put her eye to the sights. Found her target. The rearmost man in the main group, not Colton, because removing Colton first would stop the others, while removing the last man in the column removed the option of clean retreat. She breathed out slowly. Below and to the right, she knew Samuel was doing the same. His target lined up, waiting for the same moment she was waiting for. She squeezed the trigger, and the mountain answered. 2 shots. 1 echo that made it sound like 3. The rearmost rider went down. The scarred eyebrow man lurched sideways, hit but not stopped, which meant Samuel had found muscle rather than anything vital. The horses screamed with the specific panic of animals in gunfire. The column shattered. Men throwing themselves from saddles, grabbing for cover in a space that hadn't been designed to offer much. Colton was already shouting orders. Not panicked. Controlled, directional, the voice of someone who'd been in bad situations, and had learned that the voice was one of the things you could control when other things weren't. Find them. Both positions. There are only 2 of them, only 2. Right. Rose shifted position immediately. She'd committed to the first firing point and had used it once, which was once. She wasn't going to give them a second muzzle flash from the same location to triangulate from. She moved laterally along the ledge, low and fast, using the rock and the pine branches. Found the second position she'd chosen 3 days ago, when she'd stood on this ledge in the cold and thought through every angle, different sightline, same approach corridor. Below, Samuel was firing with deliberate rhythm. One shot. Work the mechanism. Assess. One more shot. The sound of it was the sound of someone who had made a private peace with what he was doing, and was doing it without wasted energy. One of Colton's men broke east, trying to flank Samuel's position from the treeline side. Smart, the right tactical move. Rose tracked him through the pine branches, let him commit to the route, and put a bullet through his thigh at 40 yards when he thought he was safely out of her sight line. He went down in the snow making sounds that meant he wasn't getting up to flank anyone. Pull back, Colton called. Regroup at the bend. They went. Not far, just around the curve, where the rock faces opened up. And clear shots from either elevated position became impossible. She could hear them reorganizing. Hear Colton's controlled voice cutting through the discussion. Hear the particular sounds of men who hadn't expected this and were recalculating what it would cost to finish it. Rose used the pause to reload. Her hands worked steadily through the familiar sequence. She noticed the steadiness and didn't comment on it internally. It was a fact about the present moment, not a judgment about the person doing the noticing. Below, Samuel caught her eye around the edge of the log. He pointed to himself, then toward the bend where Colton's group had retreated, and made a motion suggesting he wanted to pursue while they were reorganizing. She shook her head. No. They had elevation and cover. The moment they abandoned those advantages, they were in the open against a group that still outnumbered them significantly. She held up a flat palm. Hold. He acknowledged it. Stayed. The shot came from above and behind her, not from the trail. From the rock above her position. Colton had done exactly what she'd predicted he might. Sent one man to break off during the retreat and circle around, to come at her position from above. Someone who'd scaled the eastern approach to the ridge while the rest withdrew, coming over the top to get above the ledge where she was. She heard the boot on rock a half-second before the shot, which was why the bullet went past her left ear instead of through it. Rose threw herself flat. The second shot punched through, exactly where her head had been. She scrambled backward across the ledge. No purchase on ice. Slid 6 feet before she caught a handhold, heard her rifle skitter sideways and drop into a gap in the rock she could see but not reach. She had no rifle. She had the knife at her belt, and the smaller blade in her boot, and the arithmetic of a situation that had run out of good options, and was now operating strictly in acceptable ones. She pressed herself against the face of the rock below the ledge edge, waited. His silhouette appeared above. A man she didn't recognize, rifle aimed at the space where he expected her to be. He adjusted when the space was wrong. Found her. Opened his mouth to call out to the others. Rose launched upward. She drove the smaller knife through his boot into the tendons beneath, grabbed his leg with her free hand, and pulled. He lost the ledge. The fall was 20 feet, and the sound he made when he reached the rocks below was the sound of something ending. She scrambled back up. Found the spare rifle she'd positioned at the face of edge of the ledge 3 days ago, because she was prepared. His phone because she'd been afraid, and those were genuinely different things. Checked it in 3 seconds, and looked down at the trail. The situation had changed while she was dealing with the climber. Colton's remaining men had used the distraction to rush Samuel's position. She could see them clearly from above. 2 men in close with Samuel, his rifle gone somewhere in the snow, a knife in his hand, fighting with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this before, and had decided not to stop. A third man was positioning for a clear shot, but couldn't find the angle, because Samuel kept moving the 2 men who were already too close. Rose descended the rock face, faster than was strictly advisable. Her boots hit the trail and she was already running. She shot the man looking for the angle as she came around the fallen log, and he dropped. Samuel drove his knife into the man he was grappling with, the move of someone who has run the calculation and found only one solution. The man went down. Samuel straightened, and Rose saw his left leg. The blood was wrong. Too much, too fast, soaking through the wool of his trousers from a wound she hadn't seen happen. He'd been hit at some point during the fight and hadn't stopped because stopping hadn't been an option. And he was not, she was learning, a man who stopped when there was still something that needed doing. How bad, she said. Bad enough. His face was the color of old ash. Went through the thigh. Needs to be closed. Can you stand? I'm standing. Can you keep standing? Ask me in 10 minutes. She was already turning. because the full accounting of the situation wasn't finished yet. Colton. She'd counted 6 down, including the scouts who'd been neutralized when they'd turned back at the sound of gunfire and run straight into the mess at the Narrows. Colton was the 7th, and Colton hadn't been among the men she'd watched go down. He was standing 20 feet away, pistol raised, eyes on Rose with the expression of a man who had lost 6 hired guns and was doing the cold arithmetic of what that meant for his options. Not panicked, recalculating. She had the rifle, he had the pistol. The geometry was even. Neither of them moved. Impressive, Colton said. His voice was controlled in the way voices are controlled when the person using them is managing something beneath the surface. 2 people. Against 7. Now it's just you, Rose said. So it is, a beat. The child, the boy you have in that cabin. His name is Owen Farrow. His uncle has been looking for him. He watched her face for the reaction. There's a reward. Smaller than what the Calloway family's offering for you, but together. You're not going near him, Rose said. Colton began adjusting his aim. The shot came from behind him. Rose had not moved her eyes from Colton. She saw the moment it arrived on his face. Not pain first, confusion first. The confusion of a man who had accounted for every variable and encountered one he hadn't included in his accounting. He looked down. He looked up. He looked at Rose with something that was neither anger nor fear, but a kind of professional acknowledgement of an unexpected move. Then he fell forward into the snow and was still. Rose looked past where he'd been standing, 50 yards up the trail, at the upper edge of the Narrows, where the rock faces opened back into forest. Owen stood with his rifle raised, both hands, both feet planted on the frozen ground, smoke still curling from the barrel in the cold air. His face was the color of the snow around him. His hands had begun to shake, not during, but after, which was when the body remembered what it had been required to do. He'd heard it from inside the cellar, through packed earth and timber and whatever distance the mountain had put between them. He'd heard the specific sound Rose made when the scarred man's hands closed around her throat, and he'd come out of the concealed exit, the one Samuel had shown him, the one that emerged 30 yards into the trees. He'd gone around. He'd positioned himself at the upper edge of the Narrows, where the angle was clear. He'd waited until he was certain. Rose made herself walk. Everything in her body was filing complaints. But her body wasn't in charge of this particular moment. His phone never stopped ringing. She crossed the distance between herself and Owen in measured steps because running would frighten him. And he had already been frightened enough for one morning. Owen dropped the rifle when she reached him, just opened his hands and let it fall into the snow. His legs went uncertain beneath him, and Rose caught him. Both arms pulled him in, felt him shaking against her, with the full-body tremors of someone who had spent everything they had. He made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Not the managed silence of his previous crying, not careful, not controlled, just sound. A child's sound, unguarded and honest, and containing everything the last hour had cost him. You did what you had to do, Rose said into the top of his head. You hear me? You kept us here, behind them. Samuel had gotten himself upright, using the rifle as a cane, and was crossing the ground between them, with the determined progress of a man for whom the pain was real and currently irrelevant. He stopped beside them. He looked at Owen in Rose's arms. When he spoke, his voice had the sound of something that had been compressed for a long time and had just found the single point at which the pressure exceeded the container. You did good, Samuel said. Son, you hear me? That took more than I had at your age. Owen pulled back just enough to look at Samuel. His face was all of it at once. The fear and the grief and the exhaustion, and, underneath and through all of it, the specific expression of a child who has been seen accurately by someone who matters to them. Samuel put both hands on Owen's thin shoulders and held on. Not graceful, not practiced. The way you hold something when you've nearly lost it, and have only now fully understood what that would mean. Rose put her hand on Samuel's arm. He covered it with his own. The 3 of them stood on a mountain trail, with the winter sky going pale above the ridgeline, and the cabin visible through the trees. Smoke still rising from its chimney because they'd banked the fire before they left, and the fire had kept. Getting Samuel back to the cabin nearly finished what Colton's men had started. He was too heavy for Rose to carry out, and too stubborn to be carried, which meant they arrived at a compromise that was neither dignified nor efficient but was the only available option. Her shoulder is on his arm. Under shoulder, his weight distributed as evenly as the wound allowed, Owen on his other side, contributing what a 7-year-old could contribute, which was less about physical support and more about the simple refusal to let go. 20 minutes to cover a quarter mile. every step a negotiation between what the leg could bear and what the situations required. The cabin had never looked so specifically like a destination. Inside, Rose got Samuel to the chair. He sat with his leg extended, and his face the color of old ash, and his breathing controlled in the tight, deliberate way that only happens when the alternative is not controlled breathing. The wound had gone through the outer ringing. The wound had gone through the outer thigh. Bullet entered the front, exited the back, missed the bone, but caught something muscular and vascular that was unhappy about the encounter, and expressing its unhappiness in volume of blood. Rose had seen enough of Samuel Hardin's preparation in this cabin to know where the medical supplies were and what they contained. His phone never stopped ringing. She went to the wooden box on the far shelf and opened it with hands that were steady, because she needed them to be steady, and she'd built that reliability over a long time, and it was available to her now. She put the largest blade in the fire coals, watched it heat. The smell in the cabin shifted towards something she didn't name but would not forget. Owen sat down beside Samuel's chair, put his hand on Samuel's forearm. Not hesitant, not tentative. Just placed it there. The contact of someone who had decided that the man in the chair was worth staying beside and was staying. Samuel looked down at that small hand, then looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing interior accounting. "It's going to hurt," Rose said. When the blade had gone the color she needed it. "Everything hurts." He met her eyes. "Do it." She did it. The sound Samuel made was not something she chose to catalog. It took everything available in him, and then reached for reserves he shouldn't have had. Owen didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Kept his hand on Samuel's arm with steady pressure. Staying the way he'd stayed through everything, the way someone stays when staying is the most they can offer, and they've decided it's enough. Samuel lost consciousness partway through the second application. Rose finished what needed finishing, packed the wound with the antiseptic soaked cloth from the medical box, wrapped it with clean bandaging material, secured it with strips she cut from the hem of a shirt that had been hanging on the peg by the door since before she arrived. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the leg of Samuel's chair and looked at her own hands in the firelight. The blood on them was mostly not hers. She let herself shake for a minute. Just one. The measured release of everything the last several hours had accumulated, allowed precisely long enough to move through and not long enough to take up residence. Then she drew a breath, held it, let it out. Stewed. Owen came and sat beside her on the floor, moving without sound, choosing proximity the way he was learning to choose it. Deliberately, on his own terms, at his own speed. He put his hand on her arm the way he'd put it on Samuel's, the same gesture. A different person receiving it. Rose covered his hand with hers. Outside, the mountain was perfectly quiet, in the way it went quiet after large things. As though it had observed what had happened on its face and had decided not to comment. They sat there together until the fire needed attention, and then Rose stood and tended the fire, and Owen stayed close. Samuel breathed in his chair, and the afternoon light came through the small windows and moved across the floor, and eventually became evening. The work outside couldn't wait past dark. Rose pulled on her coat and told Owen to stay with Samuel, keep the fire, give him water when he woke, find her immediately if anything changed. Owen nodded with the seriousness of a child who had been given real responsibility and understood the difference between that and being managed. She went back out into the cold. 7 people. 7 trips to the ravine 100 yards into the north-facing forest. Deep enough, far enough, from the trail that what the spring thaw chose to do with them wouldn't create problems before then. Not a permanent solution. Nothing about this situation was a permanent solution, but sufficient for what they could control, which was the winter. She searched each man methodically before moving them. Weapons, ammunition, his phone never stopped ringing, anything with identifying information. Colton carried papers she folded into her coat pocket without reading. She'd read them later, when her hands had stopped doing the thing they were currently doing. The hired guns carried nothing useful for identification, which was how hired guns typically traveled, professional habit. Leave nothing that connects you to where you've been. She hauled everything back to the cabin in 2 loads. 3 rifles, 5 pistols, ammunition enough to matter, knives of varying quality. Tools that had come up this mountain in service of one purpose, and were now something else. Resources. The spoils of a calculation that had resolved correctly. By the time she finished, the stars were out, and her arms ached to the shoulder joints, and she was colder than she'd been at any point since December night she'd climbed this mountain in the dark. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment before going inside. Looked up at the sky, vast, clear, the particular black and silver of high altitude in winter, more stars than any city sky could hold. She thought about a kitchen floor in Colorado, about the decision that had put her on a stagecoach north, about the advertisement in a Silver City newspaper and the arithmetic of maybe. She thought about what you choose when choosing is all you have left. Then she went inside, 'cause it was cold, and she was done with this part, and the next part was already waiting. Samuel was awake when she came in, pale, sweating, but awake, the look of a man who'd made a private accounting of his situation and decided to remain in it, regardless of what the accounting showed. Owen had moved from the floor to the footstool beside the chair, still close, still with his hand resting on the arm of it near Samuel's. Done? Samuel asked. Done. Hidden. Not permanently, but through the winter. He nodded, looked at Owen. Something in his expression did the complicated thing. Again, the grief and relief arriving together. The specific texture of a man who keeps being surprised by what he finds himself feeling. He didn't leave, Samuel said quietly. No, stayed right there the whole time. Yes, Owen looked between them. He understood he was being talked about and seemed to have decided he didn't object to it. The people who sent Colton? Rose said, pulling the kitchen stool close to the fire and sitting on it. Her legs needed the information that sitting down was now permitted. They'll notice he hasn't reported. Yes. How long before someone comes looking? Weeks. The Moutain works in our favor for now. Samuel shifted in the chair, and the shift cost him something he didn't show on his face. And Colton wasn't official law. Whatever he told people about his authorization, he worked independently. No agency is waiting for his report. The Calloway family hired him privately. Someone else will hire someone else, eventually. But not this week. He looked at her. There's something else. Colton's men, did any of them carry papers? Anything identifying? Rose reached into her coat pocket, produced the folded documents she'd taken from Colton, smoothed them on her knee in the firelight and read them for the first time. 2 documents. The first, Colton's authorization from the Calloway family, signed by someone named Edward Calloway, who was apparently the brother of Douglas and the man currently managing the family's affairs. Standard language. Reward. Description. Return preferred. Alternative acceptable. The second document stopped her. A separate letter, different handwriting. A man named Cole Farrow. Addressed to Colton, concerning a child named Owen Farrow. Age approximately 7. Last known to be in the custody of one Samuel Hardin, of Settlers Fork, Idaho territory. The letter described the child. It described the burned homestead. It described the land that was at issue. Homestead acreage in the northern Idaho territory, surveyed value timber rights, water access, and it described the terms of the arrangement with Colton. $500 for the child's return, the definition of return being sufficiently loose to be read multiple ways. Rose read this letter twice. Then she handed it to Samuel without comment and let him read it himself. He read it once. His jaw set in the specific way it set when something made him angry, and he was managing the anger rather than expressing it. Cole Farrow is Owen's uncle. Samuel said, I gathered, he arranged the attack on the homestead. I suspected it from the beginning. The raid was too specific, too targeted, and the land was too valuable for it to be random. I never had proof. This isn't proof, Rose said. It's association. He can claim he hired Colton only to locate a missing child, his nephew. As next of kin, he can claim that. Samuel looked at Owen, and then he can claim Owen. Legally, he's blood family of a minor child. Owen had gone absolutely still. He was looking at the fire with the expression of someone who had heard every word and was holding it at a distance, while he decided what to do with it. Rose leaned forward. Owen. She waited until he looked at her. Cole Farrow is not going to take you anywhere. I want you to understand that clearly. Owen looked at her, then at Samuel, back at her. That's not a maybe, she said. That's the situation. Samuel set the letter down on the arm of the chair. We need Abe Whitfield, he said. Who is Abe Whitfield? Old trader. 70 years old, knows this territory like the lines of his own hand. He's the only person outside this cabin who knows about Owen. He paused. I told him early on, before the brides. I needed someone to know in case something happened to me. He has connections. Legal ones, in Silver City. Judge Harrison. Specifically, who is a man with opinions about what constitutes justice and how flexible the law should be in service of it. What? The kind that makes certain things official, that might not otherwise be. Rose understood what he meant. She looked at Owen, at this boy, who had survived everything that had been done to him, and was now sitting in a firelit cabin on a winter mountain, waiting to find out whether survival was going to turn out to have been worth the effort. Send for him, she said. As soon as the trail allows, he'll come without being sent for. Samuel said. He'll have heard. Word travels slow up here, but it travels. He'll come when the trail clears. They ate that evening from what Rose had prepared before the fight. Stew she'd left on the back of the stove on a low bed of coals. Rabbit and root vegetables and salt, nothing remarkable. Samuel ate slowly. Owen ate with more appetite than usual, which Rose suspected was the particular hunger that follows sustained fear when the fear finally releases. She didn't comment on it. She simply left more in the pot than she would have otherwise. After they ate, Samuel looked at Rose across the table with the expression of a man who has been deciding whether to say something for a while and has decided to say it. "Thank you," he said. "For what specifically?" "For staying, for fighting, for," he gestured with a slight motion that took in the cabin, the evening, Owen eating at the table, all of it, "for not running when you had the chance during the fight. You could have." I was down. Colton's attention was on the position. "You could have gone into the trees. That's not who I am. I know that now." He said it simply, like a thing that had been established and was no longer in question. "I didn't know it before. I know it now." Owen set down his spoon and looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has listened to an entire conversation and has decided it was satisfactory. Then he picked his spoon back up and continued eating. 3 weeks after the fight, Rose went down the mountain. Samuel's leg had crossed from healing into healed enough. He could bear weight, move through the cabin without the rifle as a cane, manage the basic operations of the place. His phone never stopped ringing. He still shouldn't have been chopping wood or climbing the roof to check snow accumulation on the chimney cap, which meant he was going to do both those things the moment she was down the trail and out of sight. She accepted this as a fixed condition of his character and planned accordingly. She told him the evening before. Not asking. Luskinum, informing. Which was how she'd learned to communicate things she'd already decided. That Nora Calloway was in Settler's Fork. That Nora had come looking not for a fugitive, but for an explanation. That Rose intended to go down and give her one. And intended to do it where it needed doing, which was not in a private room, but in the open, in the place where the story about Rose Calloway had been told and retold and bet upon for weeks. She could turn you in, Samuel said. She could. If that were her intent, she'd have come with Colton. Rose looked at him steadily. She came alone. She's been in Settler's Fork for 10 days asking questions instead of making accusations. That's not how you build a legal case. That's how you build it, understanding. You're certain enough to go. I'm certain enough that staying up here and waiting is worse than going down and facing it. She paused. And I'm certain that if I don't say the true version of what happened out loud, in front of people who can carry it forward, then the only version that exists is the one the Calloway family paid for. He was quiet for a long moment. Owen, pretending to sleep in his corner, was very still in the way he went and still when he was paying close attention to something important. Then Samuel said, 2 days. If you're not back in 2 days, I'll be back in 1. She met his eyes. But if something goes wrong, Abe knows the situation. He can help you manage whatever comes next. I know who Abe is, Samuel said, with a dryness she'd learned was his version of humor. I'm the one who told you about him. Then trust that I'll use the resource you gave me if I need it. He looked at her. Then he said the thing he'd been working up to saying, for the whole conversation. The thing underneath the logistics and the contingencies. Come back, not a request, not a command. The statement of a man for whom her return had become a fixed requirement of the world, continuing to make sense. I'll come back, Rose said. In the morning, when she was pulling on her coat and checking the rifle, Owen appeared at her elbow. He held out his drawing. The one that had grown from 3 stick figures into a landscape. The family portrait that now included the cabin and the mountain, and the small figure below Rose's that he'd labeled Baby in his careful uneven lettering. He wasn't giving it to her, he was showing her. His phone never stopped ringing. His face was entirely matter of fact, the expression of someone presenting an observation they'd made some time ago, and had been sitting with patiently, waiting for the right moment to confirm it was accurate. Rose looked at the drawing, at the small figure, at Owen's face. She had not said anything, had not told anyone, had barely told herself, had been carrying the knowledge carefully for weeks, holding it at a distance while she determined whether the world she was currently living in was one where that kind of knowledge could be safely received. His phone never stopped ringing. She'd managed the nausea in the mornings with the same efficiency she managed everything. She'd been watching the signs accumulate for the past month and a half, and had been neither confirming nor denying them to herself. Now Owen was looking at her with the patience of someone who had already arrived at the conclusion and was waiting for her to catch up. When did you figure that out? Rose said. Owen shrugged. The shrug of someone who had been paying attention and considered the timeline obvious. She looked up. Samuel was standing in the doorway to the main room. He'd heard. She could see that he'd heard in the way his whole body had gone still, in a manner distinct from his usual stillness. He crossed the room, stood in front of her, put both hands on her face. With the specific care of someone handling something they've decided matters to them enormously and intend to treat accordingly. He said nothing. His hand said what he wasn't equipped to say in words at this particular moment of the morning. Rose covered his hands with hers. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know." He let his hands drop to her shoulders. Held there. "Come back anyway." She went. The trail down had a different quality from every previous version. The first time she'd climbed it, it had been an act of desperation. Each subsequent time it had been tactical. This time she was going towards something, rather than away from something, which was still new enough to notice. Settler's Fork appeared below her. As the morning light strengthened, the cluster of buildings small against the winter landscape, smoke from chimneys, the sound of Frank Bellows's hammer already audible from the smithy before she'd fully entered the town. She went to Pete Garner's saloon first, not because she needed a drink, because Pete Garner was the kind of man who understood what things were worth saying and which things weren't, and she needed to understand the temperature of the room before she walked into it. She also needed witnesses. His phone never stopped ringing. People who would be present for what she was about to do and who would remember it accurately afterward. Pete was behind the bar when she came in, restocking shelves, with the methodical care of a man who kept his establishment, the way Samuel kept the cabin. He looked up when she entered, registered her. Set a cup of coffee at the bar in front of an empty stool without being asked. She sat. Roy Dempsey was at his usual corner table. Frank Bellows had apparently finished his early work and come in for coffee. Two other men she recognized from her first day in town. Faces that had been in the saloon the evening she arrived. Faces that had been part of the betting pool about how long she'd last. Edgar Finch was at the far end of the bar, apparently waiting for someone. Good. This was enough. Storm's been and gone, Pete said. Neutral. The greeting of a man who communicated primarily through what he chose not to say. Yes, he wiped down the bar. 7 men went up before it. Wade Colton and 6 others. He set the cloth down. Moutain in December. It happens. It does. Walt Sutton came in yesterday, Pete said. He kept his eyes on the bar as he said it, brought his ledger, said he wanted me to see something. A pause. He'd crossed out the departure column next to the 25th name. Said he was leaving it blank, and he'd made up his mind about that. Pete looked at her then. He said he'd been keeping that ledger for 2 years, and he'd never once left the departure column blank. He said I wanted someone else to know. Rose held the coffee cup in both hands. 24 names with endings. One without. Where is he now? She asked. Walt. He'll be in shortly. He comes in most mornings around this time. Rose nodded. Looked at the room, at Roy Dempsey and Frank Bellows and the 2 men at the table and Edgar Finch at the end of the bar. At Pete behind it. I'm going to need everyone to stay where they are for a while, she said. I have something to say, and I'd rather say it once, in a room, than have it travel in pieces. Pete looked at her, then at the room, then back at her. You want me to send someone for Nora Calloway? I was going to ask you that. Edgar? Pete said, without raising his voice. Edgar Finch looked up from his coffee. Go ask the woman renting your room if she'd come over. Tell her. Pete looked at Rose. Tell her Rose Harden would like to speak with her, Rose said. And tell her to come now while there are people here. Edgar left. His phone never stopped ringing. The saloon held itself at a particular pitch of attention. The specific quality of a room full of people who understood something significant was about to happen and were choosing to be present for it. Walt Sutton came in 3 minutes after Edgar left, stamping snow from his boots, his spectacles already sliding down his nose. He saw Rose at the bar. He stopped. She looked at him. He was a nervous man with a secret ledger and a habit of witnessing things that other people chose not to witness. She had been, for 22 days, the 25th name in that ledger without a departure date. Sit down, Walt, she said. He sat. Nora Calloway arrived. 8 minutes later. She came through the door with the alert stillness of someone who'd been told something was happening and had decided to see it rather than avoid it. She was dressed for the frontier in a way that suggested she'd bought the coat locally after arriving underprepared. Good instincts, even if they'd taken a few days to act on. She saw Rose at the bar, the room full of people. She understood what this was. She came in and stood near the door, which was where someone stood when they wanted to be able to leave, but hadn't decided yet whether they were going to. "Sit down," Rose said. "You came all this way. You might as well hear it properly." Nora sat down at the nearest table. Rose turned on the bar stool so she faced the room. All of it. Pete behind the bar. Roy Dempsey with his lists and his bets. Frank Bellows with his hands like mauls. Walt Sutton with his ledger and his witnessing. The two men who'd bet against her. Edgar Finch, who'd watched her buy ammunition and said nothing. Nora Calloway, who'd come 300 miles to understand something her family had told her one version of. "My name is Rose Calloway," she said. "My husband's name was Douglas Calloway. He owned mining operations in Clear Creek County, Colorado. He was well connected, he was well regarded, and for 2 years, in private, he used his fists on the woman he'd married. The saloon was very quiet. I survived it because I learned how to. I stayed, because leaving without resources and without protection meant he'd find me. And when he found me, it would be worse than if I'd never tried. I stayed and I planned, and I waited for the moment when I had enough. The alternative was death." She looked at the room without flinching. "The night he came home with his hands. Already looking for the end of it, I fought back. He died. His family called it murder. The law agreed because his family had money and I had none. And in that situation, the law tends to find what it's paid to find." Roy Dempsey had put down his coffee cup. "I came here because I needed to disappear. And Samuel Hardin's Moutain was the last place anyone would think to look for me. I stayed because I found something worth staying for." She paused. "I'm telling you this here, in this room, because the story that exists about me was written by people who had an interest in a particular version of it. I want a different version to exist. I want people who were here when I said it to be able to say they were here when I said it." The room was still. Then Nora Calloway stood up from her table. "Ellen Marsh," Nora said. Her voice was controlled in the way that cost something. "Douglas's second engagement, 1876. She left with a broken arm. My father paid her family to call it a fall from a horse." She was looking at Rose but speaking to the room. "I was 14 years old when I overheard my parents arguing about it. I understood what had happened. I chose to understand something else instead, because the truth was inconvenient and my family had a name to protect." Frank Bellows set down his coffee cup. "Sarah Briggs," Nora continued, 1873. "Douglas was 22. She left town one night, and the family never discussed it. I was 10. Too young to know what to do with what I suspected, and old enough to understand that not asking was safer." She stopped, looked at Rose directly now, not at the room. "I came here to find the woman who killed my brother. I found, instead, a woman who survived him. And a town full of people who looked at her and didn't need to be told what was true." The saloon held its silence for a moment. Then Pete Garner said, in the voice he used for facts, "I don't see anyone here who matches the description of a fugitive from Colorado. I see Mrs. Hardin from up the mountain. Come down for a visit." Roy Dempsey picked up his coffee cup again. "Same." Frank Bellows said nothing, but he stood up, walked to the bar, and put a silver dollar down next to Rose's coffee cup. "Bet you wouldn't last 2 days," he said. "I was wrong. A man pays his debts." Walt Sutton, from the end of the bar, took off his spectacles and cleaned them with his shirt tail. "Put them back on." "I'll be updating my records," he said quietly. "The 25th entry is going to stay the way it is. No departure date. That permanent notation." Nora looked at Rose. The room between them had changed. No longer the room between the sister of a dead man and the woman who'd killed him. Something else now. Something that didn't have a clean name but was real. "The reward," Nora said. "It came from estate funds. I'm the surviving heir with standing. I'm withdrawing it today. I'll wire my family's legal representation this afternoon." A pause. "The matter is closed, Cole Farrow," Rose said. "Owen's uncle. He was connected to the Calloway family's legal operation. He arranged the deaths of Owen's parents for their land." Something moved in Nora's face. The specific look of someone connecting dots they'd been avoiding. "Cole Farrow approached my father's lawyer 6 months ago. Said he had a situation in Idaho Territory that needed discreet legal support. I didn't ask what the situation was. I should have." She looked at Rose. "I know people in territorial administration, and I have a press credential that I've been very selective about using. Cole Farrow is going to find that Idaho Territory has become inhospitable to his interests. The boy has legal adoption papers, filed in Silver City, then he's protected." Nora held her gaze. "I'll make sure it stays that way." Rose looked at this woman who had come 300 miles to say a true thing out loud to someone who needed to hear it said by exactly this person, at the cost of what it had taken her to stand up in a room full of strangers and say her brother's name alongside the names of the women he'd damaged. "Thank you," Rose said. Don't. Nora picked up her coat. Thank me by living differently than he made you live. That's all I want for coming this far. She left. The saloon settled back into itself. Pete poured more coffee. Roy Dempsey opened his list and looked at it for a long moment, then folded it and put it in his pocket and did not take it out again. Walt Sutton finished his coffee, replaced his spectacles, and stood. I'm going to go update the ledger, he said. To Rose specifically, directly, looking at her over the top of his spectacles, with the seriousness of a man who had been keeping a record for 2 years and understood what it meant to close a column. It's a good record to have. Of someone who stayed, he left. The doorbell never stopped ringing. The doorbell marked his exit. Rose sat at Pete Garner's bar with her coffee, and the silver dollar Frank Bellows had paid, and the specific weight of what had just happened in a room full of people who would carry it forward. She put the silver dollar in her coat pocket, finished the coffee. Stewed. Thank you, Pete, she said. I didn't do anything, Pete said. He was already back at his shelves. Nothing to thank me for. She went back up the mountain. Rose went down the mountain 3 days later. Samuel's leg had crossed from healing into healed enough. He could bear weight, could move through the cabin without the rifle as a cane, could manage the basic operations of the place without assistance. He still shouldn't have been cutting wood or climbing the roof to check the chimney cap, which meant he was going to do both those things the moment she was down the trail and out of sight, which she accepted as a fixed condition of his character. She'd told him the evening before, not asking, informing, which was how she'd learned to communicate things she'd already decided, that Nora Calloway was in Settler's Fork. That Nora had come looking not for a fugitive, but for an explanation, which was different. That Rose intended to go down and provide one. She could turn you in, Samuel said. She could. If that were her intent, she'd have come up here with Colton. She might be building a case. Gathering enough to make the legal claim airtight. She's a journalist, Rose said. She's building a story. There's a difference between those two things, and I believe she understands the difference. How certain are you? Sir. And up to go. She looked at him. And if I'm wrong, then at least I said the true version of what happened, out loud to someone, before a court got to say its version. He was quiet for a long time after that. The fire talked to itself. Owen, pretending to sleep in his corner, was very still in the way he went still when he was paying close attention. 2 days, Samuel said finally. If you're not back in 2 days, I'll be back in 1. She paused. But if something prevents that, Abe Whitfield knows the situation. He can help you manage whatever comes next. I don't want Abe Whitfield's help managing what comes next. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His profile in the firelight was the profile she'd been reading for weeks now, learning its particular grammar. The jaw, set a certain way when he was managing something, rather than expressing it, the small change around the eyes when something moved him past the usual defenses. Come back, he said. Not a request, not a command. The statement of a man for whom this had become a fixed requirement of the world continuing to make sense. I'll come back, Rose said. In the morning, when she was putting on her coat and Kachek's rifle and going through the preparations of someone who did not leave the cabin without being prepared, Owen appeared at her elbow. He held out the drawing, the family portrait, the one that had been on the wall and had been taken down and added to many times. He held it out not to give it to her, but to show her. He'd added something. A small figure, barely sketched, positioned below and slightly in front of the medium-sized figure that represented Rose. The new figure was smaller than Owen's self-portrait. Much below it, in his improving but still labored lettering, Mabby. Rose stared at the drawing. Had barely told herself, had been holding the knowledge carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you're not yet certain what to do with it, when you're still taking the measure of whether the world you're currently in is one where fragile things can survive. She'd been careful. She'd managed the nausea in the mornings with the same efficient pragmatism she managed everything. She'd been carrying it privately, the way she'd carried private things for years. Owen looked at her. Then at the drawing. Back at her. His expression was entirely matter-of-fact, the expression of someone reporting an observation he'd made some time ago, and was only now choosing to share. She looked up. Samuel was standing in the doorway to the main room. He'd heard. She could see that he'd heard in the way his whole body had gone still, in a manner distinct from his usual stillness. He didn't speak. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. Put both hands on her face. Gently, with the specific care of someone handling something they've decided matters to them enormously and intend to treat accordingly. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His hands said it. The whole of what he was or wasn't equipped to say in words. communicated through the simplest possible contact. Rose covered his hands with hers. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know." He let his hands drop to her shoulders, held there. Come back anyway," she went. The trail down was a different journey from every previous version of it. The first time she'd climbed it, it had been an act of desperation, a woman with no options left choosing the least bad one in the dark. Each subsequent time it had been tactical, maintenance of a position, management of a situation. This time it was something else. She was going towards something, rather than away from something, which was a distinction she was still learning to feel as real, rather than just think as concept. Settler's Fork came into view below as she descended, the cluster of buildings small against the winter landscape. Thin smoke from chimneys, the particular look of a small place doing what it could. She watched it come closer without the specific dread she'd felt the first time she'd approached it, when the town had represented only exposure and danger. She stopped at Pete Garner's saloon first. Pete was behind the bar restocking shelves in the methodical way of a man who kept his establishment with the same logic. Samuel, he kept the cabin. Everything, with a place, everything, in it. He looked up when she came in, registered her, set a cup of coffee at the bar in front of an empty stool without being asked. She sat, "Storm's been and gone, Sim," Pete said, neutral. The greeting of a man who communicated by selecting what not to say. Yes, he wiped down the bar. 7 men went up before it, Colton and 6 others. Mountain weather in December, he set down the cloth. "It happens, it does. Walt Sutton had a conversation with me recently. About his ledger." Pete looked at the bar rather than at her. "He's decided the 25th entry doesn't need a departure date. He said he's keeping the column blank, and he's not changing his mind about that." Rose held the coffee cup in both hands and let that settle. 24 names with endings. 1 name without. "Where is Nora Calloway staying?" she asked. "Rented a room from Edgar Finch. Northeast corner of town." Rose put money on the bar. Stood. "Thank you, Pete." "Nothing to thank me for," Pete said, and went back to his shelves. She found Nora Calloway in a small room that smelled like cedar and the impermanence of temporary habitation. Nora was at a writing desk with a notebook open in front of her, a pen in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been working on the same sentence for longer than the sentence it deserved. She looked up when Rose 7 years old. Dark hair, Douglas's bone structure without Douglas's particular quality of watching everything for advantage. Her eyes were honest in the specific way that hurts. The honesty of someone who has spent years being very skilled at not seeing certain things, and has recently had to reckon with the cost of that skill. Neither of them spoke for a moment that was long enough to acknowledge what the moment was. Then Nora said, "You look like someone who's been through something. Several somethings." Rose said, "You look like you won. We won." Rose came into the room and sat in the chair nearest the door, which was not the chair most people would have chosen but was the one that gave her the clearest view of the space. The rifle was across her back. She didn't put it down. Nora looked at it, then at Rose's face. "I'm not going to try to take you anywhere," she said. "I know. Then why the rifle?" "Because I keep it. Everywhere." Nora absorbed this. She looked at her notebook, at the sentence she'd been failing to complete. "I've been in this town for 10 days. I've talked to everyone who was willing to talk, and some who weren't, and I've written approximately 400 words that I've subsequently crossed out." She set the pen down. "I kept thinking I'd know what to say when I found you. I'm a journalist. Constructing things out of facts and order is what I do." His phone never We had different versions of this conversation prepared. What happened to them? "I looked at that mountain every morning and tried to imagine what would make someone climb it in December. And none of my versions could account for that." She met Rose's eyes. "None of them accounted for someone choosing this. I didn't choose it because I wanted it," Rose said. "I chose it because the alternative was worse." "Tell me," Nora said. So Rose told her, not the newspaper version, not the version the Calloway family's money had built and maintained. The true one, 2 years of it. The specific texture and weight of what it was to live inside a situation that presented one face to the world and was entirely something else from inside. The learning of small variables, the management of triggers, the constant calculation of how to get through one or two vow today and then the next without the thing you were preventing happening. The way you stopped being a person with preferences and became a function of keeping yourself alive for one more day. The locked rooms, the broken ribs that she'd told the doctor in Denver were from a riding accident because the doctor owed his practice to Douglas Calloway's financial influence. And they'd both understood what his examination would conclude regardless of what she told him, the final night. the way the decision had already been made before she made it, made by the accumulation of everything that had come before, by the look in Douglas's eyes when he came through the door that night, by the knowledge that had arrived suddenly and completely that this was the night it would end, and she was the only one who could determine how. The knife. The look on his face, the running. Nora listened. She didn't write anything down. She didn't ask clarifying questions. She just listened with the full attention of someone who had decided that what they were hearing mattered enough to receive properly. When Rose finished, the room was quiet for long enough that the sounds of Settler's Fork outside, a horse, voices, the ring of Frank Bellows's hammer from the direction of the smithy, became audible, the ordinary sounds of a small place doing its ordinary business. Then Nora said, "Ellen Marsh." Rose waited. Douglas's second engagement. 1876. She left the engagement with a broken arm. The family told everyone she'd had a fall. My father paid the Marsh family enough money to not dispute that version. Nora said this with the flatness of someone reading from a document they'd memorized and were tired of. I was 14 years old. I heard my parents arguing about it late at night, and I understood enough to know what had happened, and I chose not to know it consciously. She paused. That was the first time I made that choice. The second? Sarah Briggs. 1873. Douglas was 22. She left town in the middle of the night, and the family never discussed where she went or why. I was 10. I was too young to know what to do with what I suspected, and old enough to understand that not knowing was safer. Rose looked at her. And now I am 27 years old, and my brother is dead, and I came 300 miles to find the woman who killed him, and I've found instead. Nora stopped. Looked at her hands. I've found that every version of this story I was told had a version inside it that I chose not to look at, and that my choice not to look cost people things that couldn't be recovered. You were a child for most of it. I was an adult for the last 2 years of your marriage. Rose held her gaze. Yes, I knew something was wrong. The times I visited, the times you came to family events, I saw things. I told myself I was misreading them. Her voice was entirely level, which was costing her something. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself Douglas wouldn't, that he wasn't capable of. She stopped. I knew, not in specifics, but I knew something was wrong, and I chose the version of things that required less of me. And now you're here. Now I'm here. Nora looked up. I'm not going to tell you I came to make it right. I can't make it right. What was done to you can't be made right by an apology from Douglas's sister. She straightened in her chair. What I can do is end the legal pursuit. I'm the surviving heir with standing in Douglas's estate. The bounty Colton was operating under came from estate funds. I can withdraw it. I can instruct the family's legal representation that the matter is closed. Why would you do that? The question was honest, and Nora heard it that way. She took the time to answer it honestly, because my brother was a man who used his wealth and his name to do things to people who couldn't fight back, and then used the same wealth and name to ensure that the story told about him was a different story. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. And because you did fight back, and you're alive, and you've built something on that mountain that nobody gave you and nobody can take from you. And the least I can do, the very least, is make sure the machinery of my family's money stops being pointed at you. Rose looked at this woman across the small desk. At the specific quality of someone carrying something for a long time and choosing, finally, to set it down. There's a boy on that mountain, Rose said. 7 years old. His parents were killed for their land. His uncle arranged it. The boy has been legally adopted. The papers are filed in Silver City. Cole Farrow has no legal claim. Nora was very still. Cole Farrow, she said slowly. He approached the family about 6 months ago. Said he had a situation in Idaho Territory that might benefit from discreet legal support. My father's lawyer handled it. She paused. I didn't ask what the situation was. I should have asked. No one connected to Cole Farrow comes near that child, Rose said. That's not negotiable, I understand. Nora picked up her pen. I know people in territorial administration, and I know how to use a press credential in ways that make certain people's situations suddenly very public. Cole Farrow will find that Idaho Territory is no longer a comfortable place for him to do business. Rose stood, picked up the rifle, settled it across her back in the familiar position. Nora, she said. The woman looked up. Live differently than he did, Rose said it simply, not as a command. As the only piece of advice she had to offer that was worth giving. That's all. Just live differently. Nora held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Not the social nod, the real one. The one that meant she'd heard it and was going to try. You too, Nora said. For whatever it's worth. You too. Rose was back on the mountain before dark. The climb felt different from every previous version of it. Not shorter. The mountain was still the mountain, the distance was still the distance. December was still December, even if it was nearly January now. But the quality of the effort had changed. Before, she'd always been climbing away from something. This time she was climbing toward specific things. A man who'd said come back twice. A man who'd said come back twice because once hadn't contained everything he meant. A boy who'd been adding to his drawing since the morning she left. A fire that had been banked before she went and would still be going when she arrived. The clearing appeared ahead of her as the last light went flat and golden. The cabin. Smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air. No wind. The evening gone entirely calm. The hush of a mountain that had watched the day complete itself. And found nothing requiring comment. Samuel was at the woodpile. He'd been splitting wood despite the leg. Exactly as she'd predicted. He'd do the moment she was out of sight. He had the axe in his hand, and he'd stopped mid-swing when he heard her on the trail, and was simply standing there, watching her come across the clearing, not pretending he'd been doing anything else. Owen came around the corner of the cabin running. Actually running, the full committed running of a child who'd recently remembered that his body could do this, and was making up for the months when it hadn't. He miscalculated the closing distance slightly, which was the kind of miscalculation only possible when you weren't calculating every approach for threat. He hit Rose at approximately her midsection with enough momentum to rock her back a step. She caught him, both arms. The momentum carried them through a half-turn, and then they were still, and he was holding on in the way of someone who'd been waiting and was now done waiting. Samuel walked across the clearing. Steadily, not quickly, the leg still had its opinions. He stopped close enough that the distance between them wasn't distance anymore. "Well?" he said. "She's going back to Denver. The reward is withdrawn." Rose looked at him. "The Calloway family will be told the trail went cold in Silver City. Nora's closing the matter through the legal representation. And Cole Farrow? Nora has connections in territorial administration, and she intends to use a press credential in ways that will make pursuing Idaho Territory interests very costly for him." Rose paused. She was also in that room when she said it, with Roy Dempsey and Frank Bellows and Walt Sutton and Pete Garner. The story that exists now is not the story the Calloway family paid for. Samuel absorbed this. "You believe her?" "Yes, why?" Rose thought. A woman, fattest out a woman standing up in Pete Garner's saloon and saying her brother's name alongside the names of Ellen Marsh and Sarah Briggs, in front of everyone who was there to hear it. Because she said the true thing in public. You don't come 300 miles to do that, unless you mean it. Owen had released her and stepped back but hadn't gone far. He was standing close in the way he'd been standing close since the fight. Not attached but present, within arm's reach by preference rather than necessity. He looked up at her. Then at Samuel. Then he said, with the careful articulation of someone rebuilding their relationship with language one word at a time. "You came back. I said I would," Rose said. He nodded. This matched what the data indicated. He went back around the cabin to whatever he'd been doing before she arrived, which turned out to be arranging flat stones in a configuration that had clearly been planned in advance, and was now being executed with focused precision. Samuel watched him go. Then looked at Rose. "He's been planning that since yesterday morning," Samuel said. "What is it?" "He hasn't said." "I've stopped asking until things are finished." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "It's faster that way." They went inside. That evening, after Owen had eaten, and had fallen asleep in his corner, with the rifle within reach and his hand resting it, Rose sat with Samuel, by the fire. His phone never stopped ringing. She'd been deciding how to say it since the morning on the mountain, when Owen had held up the drawing with the small figure labeled baby, and looked at her with his patient matter-of-fact expression. She'd been deciding all day, through the walk down, and the hour in the saloon, and the walk back up. She'd arrived at no elegant version. "I need to tell you something," she said. Samuel looked at the coals. "I think I already know. Owen showed you." "Owen showed me about a week after you went to Settler's Fork. He came to the woodpile and held up his drawing and pointed at the new figure and then looked at me the way he looks at me when he's presenting information he considers obvious and is waiting for me to catch up. A pause. I've been waiting for you to say it. It seemed like it should come from you." Rose looked at the fire. "I wasn't certain right away. I've been watching the signs for a month and a half. Now I'm certain." She met his eyes. "I was already carrying it when I came up this mountain. I didn't know it yet. It would have been too early to know. But it was already there. How long?" "The child will arrive in summer. July, I think." Maybe August. He was quiet for a moment. The coals settled. Outside, wind moved through the trees. The soft sound of a winter evening that had decided to be gentle about itself. Hardin, Samuel said. He said it the way she'd said it to herself in Settler's Fork, when she'd introduced herself as Rose Hardin. Trying the weight of it, that's what the papers say, Rose said. He put his hand over hers. The gesture he'd been learning, slow, deliberate, not entirely natural yet but genuine, which mattered more than natural in the end. Then we have a room to build, he said, and a garden to plan. And between now and summer, enough work to keep both of us occupied. That's enough time, Rose said. It's enough, he agreed. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built deliberately. Not peace in the abstract. The Moutain didn't trade in abstractions. Peace in the concrete, earned, constructed, maintained by the daily work of 3 people who had chosen each other and were now living out the consequences of that choice. Samuel's leg completed its healing. Owen spoke more. Not in floods. The words came deliberately, chosen with care. But they came. One morning in late January, he stood at the window and said to no one in particular. Snow stopped. On a February afternoon, he told Samuel, without being asked, that the east wall of the cabin made a sound when the temperature dropped sharply, and that Samuel should check the timber, because it sounded like something had shifted. Samuel checked. Something had shifted. He repaired it. Owen's first full unprompted conversation happened in March, while he was helping Rose go through the food stores to plan for spring resupply. He counted the remaining flour sacks, counted the coffee, counted the dried beans, and then said, with the practical attention of someone who had been thinking about logistics, "We'll need more of everything in April. There are 3 of us now, and there'll be 4. We should tell Abe before his first trip." Rose set down the jar she was holding. "You're right," she said. Owen went back to counting beans. He'd said what needed saying. That was sufficient. Abe Whitfield came in early April with the first warm weather, on his mule, at his unhurried pace. He brought supplies and a document from Silver City. The land trust for Owen, filed properly, the Hardin names listed as trustees, Cole Farrow's claim legally extinguished. He also brought word that Cole Farrow had relocated to Nevada after a Denver journalist had begun asking specific questions about Idaho Territory land transactions and the methods by which certain homesteads had changed hands. Owen listened to all of this from the table where he was drawing. When Abe finished, Owen put down his charcoal and looked at the trust document for a long moment. "Mine," he said. "Yours," Rose said, "until you're old enough to decide what to do with it." He picked his charcoal back up and went back to his drawing. "Good boy," Abe said. "Yes," Samuel said. "He is." The garden went in the first week of April. Owen had planned it across the whole winter. The stone border he'd been laying out the day Rose returned from Settler's Fork had been the garden's frame. He presented the plan to Samuel and Rose with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about this for months and considered every decision final. Carrots in the east-facing section for the morning light. Beans along the stopped ringing. Beans along the south wall to climb the timber. Tomatoes in the sheltered corner. Squash along the western edge where the runoff had enriched the soil. They worked the plot together on a clear cold morning, turning soil that had been frozen since October into something that could receive seeds. Owen directed. Samuel executed the heavy work. Rose planted, which was slower work, which gave her time to look up at intervals at the mountain rising above them and the cabin behind them, and the smoke from the chimney that Owen built up before they'd come outside because he'd understood. It would be a cold morning, and had done something about it without being asked. She was on her knees in the turned earth, pressing seeds into a row Owen had marked when she heard him say to Samuel across the garden, "Next year we'll need more space." Samuel, driving a stake for the bean vines, paused. "More space for what?" "More vegetables." Owen's voice was matter of fact. "There will be more of us then. The baby will be eating by next summer." Samuel looked at Rose. Rose looked at the soil under her hands, at the earth that was hers, at the mountain above her that was hers, at the cabin behind her with the drawing on its wall, and the fire in its hearth and the months of accumulated work in its walls that had made it into what it was. Not given, made. Every inch of it, made by people who had decided to stay and work, and choose each other on days when choosing each other was easy, and on days when it was the hardest available option. She put her hands into the ground and kept planting. The mountain rose above them in the April light. The snow on the high faces would persist until June. The sky above it was the blue of a season that had earned its arrival. Somewhere down in Settler's Fork, Walt Sutton had a ledger with 25 names in it, and 24 departure dates, and one blank column that was going to stay blank. And up here, in a garden that hadn't existed 3 months ago, a boy who'd learned to talk again was arguing with a man who'd learned to laugh again about the best location for the squash, and a woman who'd stopped running was planting seeds in ground she intended to be standing on when they came up. Which was, she had learned exactly what belonging felt like, not the absence of hard things still coming, not the guarantee of safe passage through every season that lay ahead. Just the knowledge that whatever came next, she would face it from ground that was hers, with people who were hers, in a life that she had chosen and built and intended to keep. Rose Hardin pressed another seed into the turned earth of Savage Mountain and thought, made. Yes, that was the right word for all of it, made.